You are now live.
I'm going to call this hearing to order. I am Phil Mendelson, the Chair of the Council, Chair of the Committee of the Whole, and this is a hearing of the Committee of the Whole. This is a hearing that we have every year where the Mayor presents her proposed fiscal year budget for fiscal year 2021, as well as perhaps speak to the related legislation that was submitted yesterday, including the supplemental budget for the current fiscal year. The time is 12:46 in the afternoon of Tuesday, May 19th, and this hearing is being conducted virtually. Having said that, let me lay out a few ground rules and also explain something. This is I believe the first council hearing that we are holding virtually, and although the council secretary has started off the hearing, I believe that the committee director is the host. And I'm saying that for colleagues because we are all going to learn our way through having these virtual hearings. All the members are on, as well as a number of representatives of the mayor and her senior team, as well as the chief financial officer. And I believe other than that, the participants are locked, meaning nobody else can come into the room. And in fact, if you get out of the room, you may have difficulty getting back into the room, which is why members have Evan Cash's phone number or email so that you can desperately dial help if you want to get back into the room. We have time limits and we're going to see how that works. It's my assumption that on the Zoom platform that it can become a bit tedious if somebody talks a really long time. That is why in the past where we've had 10-minute rounds for members, we will instead have two 5-minute rounds in their place. And I recommend that everybody who's participating have on their laptop or on their monitor the gallery view so that you can see the timer, because supposedly we are adhering to a clock. I've asked that the executive and the chief financial officer keep their statements to 10 minutes each. There will be no opening statements from members. There will be, after the mayor and the chief financial officer and the city administrator testify, there will be 2 5-minute rounds with the mayor. And then, as has been our practice in the past, if the mayor wants to leave, she can. And there'll be 2 additional 5-minute rounds that members will have. Having said all that, let's begin with the mayor. Mayor Bowser, welcome. Thank you for doing this, even though it's not quite the same, doing it over a computer rather than in person. And if you want to begin, please do.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'm Muriel Bowser. I'm the mayor of Washington, D.C., and I am pleased to be joined today for my annual testimony to the Council of the District of Columbia on my fiscal 21 budget. I'm joined today by the district's chief financial officer, Jeffrey DeWitt, the city administrator for the District of Columbia, Rashad Young, and my budget director, Jenny Reed. I am pleased to present testimony today. We are located in the old council chambers at Old Judiciary Square. So I'm testifying on the fiscal 21 budget. We call this one DC Hope, representing health, opportunity, prosperity, and equity. This budget is unique in that when we started building it, our world was very different. And it's very different than the place that we are today. Where our challenges are great, Washington, D.C. is fortunate that we went into this crisis in a very strong financial position. A place we got because of many years of being responsible stewards of our taxpayer dollars. I was proud of the budget we were preparing to submit several weeks ago. And while this budget reflects the impacts of the global coronavirus pandemic, I am proud that it also reflects our ongoing commitment and fiscal responsibility without compromising our shared DC values. For our community, the district's commitment to building a strong and resilient economy has meant more investments in our people and our neighborhoods. Together, we invested in and built the fastest improving public school system in the nation, transformed our homeless services system, and funded the largest per capita housing production trust fund in our nation. The strength of our economy going into this crisis has also allowed us to make significant investments in our response. To date, DC has allocated nearly $200 million of our own funds for our COVID-19 response and recovery. We anticipate that these costs will grow by hundreds of millions of dollars over the coming weeks and months. We will, of course, seek federal reimbursement and use federal resources wherever possible to help offset these costs. Despite a substantial loss of revenue, the fiscal 21 budget proposal, which is $16.7 billion, and it includes $8.5 billion in local funds. It continues to make significant investments in DC residents. With a focus on health, opportunity, prosperity, and equity, this budget provides a sense of hope that even in times of unprecedented crisis, we can live up to our values. In just a few months, this pandemic has laid bare distressing health disparities that exist across our country and within our own community. We know that these disparities are the result of generations of discriminatory practices and systems that have negatively impacted the health and well-being of people of color. This budget recognizes that in order to build a healthier, more equitable, and more resilient city, we must improve our healthcare system while also addressing the social determinants that drive health outcomes. Speaking about health, DC is home to nationally recognized systems of care. We know, however, that our hospitals are not evenly distributed and that most acute care facilities are concentrated in Northwest DC. Last month, I announced 2 monumental agreements to improve our healthcare system and address inequalities in health outcomes in DC residents. The agreements include the construction of 2 new state-of-the-art hospitals. First, a 136-bed facility at St. Elizabeth's Hospital, and second, a 225-bed new facility at Howard University. The DC Hope budget supports these agreements with $306 million invested at St. Elizabeth's for a community hospital, $69 million for ambulatory complex to support a stronger network of care in Ward 7 and 8, and $4.2 million to support 5 centers of excellence at Howard University Hospital. The budget also includes $4.8 million to support the recommendations of the Mayor's Commission on Healthcare Systems Transformation, including investments to reduce reliance on emergency care and $400,000 to improve prenatal care. Through these investments, we can transform our healthcare system by promoting equity in care, access, and outcomes. We can also support the health of our residents by expanding access to stable housing, high quality learning opportunities, safe neighborhoods, and other opportunities that support the aspirations of our residents. Despite the difficult circumstances that we face, I remain steadfast in my commitment to affordable housing. You will see this commitment reflected in a number of investments, including a $100 million investment in the Housing Production Trust Fund and $76 million in capital funding to renovate, rehabilitate, and refresh public housing units. Additionally, to help more seniors age in place, this budget includes $5 million to continue the very successful Safe at Home program. Another way we create opportunity, of course, is through education. And this budget continues our robust investments in education with a 3% increase in the uniform per pupil student funding formula. It also includes $1.4 billion over the next 6 years to modernize 41 schools and $75 million in capital funds to support 17 schools in the creation of 540 new early child care seats and 180 pre-K seats. to build on our investment in early childhood education. Additionally, this budget includes the necessary funding to create a permanent home for Ward 8's Excel Academy for girls, as well as $52 million to transform Spingarn High School into a permanent home for the DC Infrastructure Academy. Prosperity, of course, is on our mind of how we bring back our district's economy and make it more fair for everyone. And of course, in pre-pandemic DC, one of our collective priorities and the focus of many of our previous budgets has been in making our city's prosperity more inclusive. Even as we face this financial challenge, this work to expand prosperity continues through many investments, including $250,000 to help returning citizens start new businesses and launch careers, $7 million in our Great Streets and Neighborhood Prosperity Fund for business development with a focus on mixed-use development in high employment areas, and expanded access to our opportunity accounts, which is a 4-to-1 match savings program for DC residents. Equity, of course, is front and center in our approach to this budget in response to this pandemic. Later, I look forward to sharing the initial Reopen DC Advisory Group report. You might remember when I announced this advisory group, I said that we have a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to not just open back to the way things were, but to reopen better than we were before. This DC Hope budget supports the work we are doing to build a more equitable city, including investments in affordable programs and successful programs that represent our shared values. $12.8 million, for example, towards Homeward DC, building on our commitment to Homeward DC over the last 5 years. $4.3 million to fully fund the Fair Elections Amendment Act, and $2.5 million for the Immigrant Justice Legal Services Grant, a program I started 3 years ago. As I said at the beginning of my testimony, I am proud that the fiscal year 2021 budget stays true to our values, and it reflects a responsible way to use our reserves and our ongoing commitment to good government. I want to thank my budget team led by Budget Director Jenny Reed, the city administrator and his entire team for working with all of our stakeholders, our agency directors, our partners in organized labor, and all of our employees. I also want to thank Chief Financial Officer DeWitt, who has been very diligent in helping us build now 2 budgets in the last several weeks. And I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, and all the members of the council who have also shared very good ideas throughout this process, including our first set of budget engagement forums and leading up to this change. Members of the public also contributed early in the process. At our budget engagement forums where over 1,200 people participated. So with that, I'll stop, and at the conclusion of Mr. DeWitt's testimony, be happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Mayor Bowser. Mr. City Administrator, do you go next, or do I go to the CFO?
Mr. Chairman, to the CFO, please.
All right, Mr. DeWitt.
Good afternoon, Chairman Mendelson and members of the Committee of the Whole. I'm Jeffrey DeWitt, Chief Financial Officer of the District of Columbia, and I'm pleased to appear before you today to testify on the fiscal 21 to 24 proposed budget and financial plan. The FY21 proposed budget includes $8.5 billion in local funds and $16.7 billion in gross funds, excluding intra-district funds. The Office of the Chief Financial Officer worked closely with the Mayor's executive leadership team, the City Administrator's Office of Budget and Performance, management staff, and agency program staff to produce a balanced budget and 5-year financial plan. The FY 2021 budget reflects the executive's funding priorities and determinations. The FY 2021 to FY 2024 budget and financial plan makes prudent use of reserves, utilizes federal funding, reduces certain program expenditures, and refinances debt. And therefore, after careful review, I certify that the FY 21 to 24 budget and financial plan is balanced. The testimony you have before you is really, in essence, the certification letter that's contained in volume 1 of the budget, which you can see online or in the books that have been provided to you if you've been able to pick them up. I'm going to just summarize that briefly and not bore you with reading the entire letter, and just give you a bit of a summary of that. As the mayor had mentioned, we were just on the cusp of certifying the previous budget before we redid the revenue estimates in April that reflect the budget you see before you, which largely is in that 700 plus range in both 2020 and 2021. So there's both a supplemental budget and an FY2021 budget. That reflects what we're seeing in the economy, which all of us see every day. The restaurants that are doing only takeout, hotels that are barely open, convention center that's closed, all the impacts on the unemployment levels that we're seeing, and the impacts on our unemployment system and on our income taxes that reflect that, and the struggle some residents are having with, businesses are having with things like property taxes. So the forecast, as has been mentioned several times, assumes that we will begin reopening sometime this summer, and that there will be a gradual reopening. And I and Chairman Mendelson both said on the Reopen DC task force the mayor put together as a steering committee, as do many other members of the community. And we're working together to try to understand and figure out how businesses can reopen. And the forecast makes some assumptions about that, obviously. When will restaurants reopen? What level will they reopen? When will hotels come? When will conventions come back? How are small businesses going to recover? All those factors are built in. And in looking at that and talking to the business community, what we see is what we call a U-shaped recovery. We're down, we're on the bottom right now. We're going to be there until we begin reopening. And then we'll start a gradual reopening. And as I mentioned yesterday, if you look at the presentation we did a few weeks ago, it looks kind of like a Nike swoosh. You go down and then you go back up at a fairly steep slope, but not straight back up. And you won't really see the full recovery until 2022 as all these businesses get back to full levels, and hopefully there is a vaccine in place for the virus that allows a full recovery of the economy. So all that reflects what we're looking at. And what I will speak to the council as you deliberate over the coming weeks is to remember there's uncertainty in that forecast. And I'll just give you some examples of that. And that's why when we looked at how to do this, we talked about how to do it in a responsible way that has the least impact on the programs and things that we'd like to do, but does it in a responsible way given all the uncertainties. We modeled a second wave or a second shutdown that could have happened. That's not what we budgeted. That's not what we forecasted. But a second wave, if it were to come in the fall or next spring and you had to go into shutdown and back up, that could be in the modeling another $300 million on top of what you've already seen. So you need to be cognizant of that, prepared for that. And if you spend every dime today to do everything today, and you don't have any resiliency built in, and anything happens, there could be really dramatic impacts on the government. So I just ask you to keep that in mind. As we were looking at this, if you recall, we met with you all at your retreat in early February, and we showed you a recession plan that we were putting together, not knowing that we would actually use it immediately. That wasn't really the intent of doing it. But we talked about the tools that we could use to get through a downturn in the economy in that session with you as we laid out what a recession plan would look like. I can tell you we used every single one of those tools. We put it behind glass right after the council workshop, and we broke it a few weeks later and have deployed all those in the budget. And that includes things like looking at refunding our debt that's available and structuring it in a way to give us some cash flow relief in 20 and 21. And that's about $80 million in the financial plan that you can only do because of our high credit rating. We looked at what reserves could you use to be prudent in terms of being ready for things that are coming, but using them as much as we possibly can to minimize the impacts on the programs. And you'll see in the budget and financial plan, the fiscal stability reserve is completely used in 2021 and then paid back at the end of the financial plan in 23 and 24 when you have the recovery in full force under the forecast. We also used things like that has been talked about. We've been retiring the debt early on the baseball stadium. And so you'll see some use in the financial plan of that in 2020, 21, and 2022. But because 2019 was so good, we had advanced, we'd actually accelerated that refunding. We'll still be retiring that debt by 2026, 9 years before they're due, even using $105 million of that extra revenue coming in that we normally would have retired debt for, and we're not going to be doing that. If you look in totality and you look in the long-range capital and financial plan, you will see that we used over $1.2 billion of reserves to balance this budget, which is why the impacts are maybe not as severe, or they felt like as you're going through it, as severe as some people thought it might be. But that gives us our contingency, our emergency, and our cash flow reserve to handle the great uncertainties we may be facing in 2021. And it also is what would be required for us to keep our high credit rating. And let me explain the value of maintaining that as we go through this. If we were to have our credit significantly downgraded back to maybe where the level was even just 4 or 5 years ago, we wouldn't be able to do that emergency refinancing and save $80 million. We would have to cut probably $500+ million out of the capital program because the borrowing costs would be higher. We may have to go and borrow some emergency funding to handle our day-to-day expenditures, which you would have to then pay back in the financial plan. So if you borrow past a year, you got to pay it back. So you get far more money by having a AAA credit than by not having a AAA credit. And just to give you a feel for that, 2 weeks ago in the market, if you were a AAA city or entity or a AA city, both very, very high, the difference in borrowing during that 2-week period was 15 to 30% higher to borrow in order to do that, because the market is scared that there's a lot of cities that are going to be in trouble and AAA credit ratings are highly valued. So those are things to think about is as you're looking at this, you want to manage your resources prudently. We're using $1.2 billion in reserves. We're using the CARE Act. So the money from the federal government is used in the budget to help cover expenses, to deal with all the recovery issues that we have, and we're using that also in guidance from the U.S. Treasury Office as we receive guidance on looking at that. And there's obviously program changes in there and money for schools and all those types of things. When you look at it in totality, it is still a strong credit. It does the things that are the priorities, and it is something that we can be very proud of. And I guess I would say, and I know Jen Budoff's on there, and I remember when we were briefing her earlier, the council's budget director, thank goodness for FY2019, because a lot of the reserves we're using are those extra reserves that we got in 2019. So I am very comfortable certifying this budget. And I ask you, as you look at it, as it's turned over to you, think about the uncertainty that's ahead. Think about how we do this in a way that maximizes our resources. And I can tell you, we pulled every single thing we could think of to try to minimize the impacts. Every tool we could think of has been applied here to try to minimize the impacts and get as much resources and maintain as many programs as possible. And I look forward to working with you to do the same thing in the coming weeks. And so with that in closing, I want to take this has been a difficult period we've all been going through as we do this budget. I want to thank the mayor and her executive team, along with the Office of Budget and Planning and the Associate Chief Financial Officers and their staffs, the Office of Revenue and Analysis, and others in the OCFO, whose hard work was allowed us to effectively work together to produce a balanced budget. I look forward to working with you and the council in the coming weeks during the upcoming budget deliberations, and I'm available to answer any questions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the council.
Thank you, CFO DeWitt. Mr. Young or Ms. Reed are also there, but you do not have statements. Is that correct?
That's correct, Mr. Chairman. No opening
Okay,
comments.
so we'll begin with questions, and I will start. And I want to remind folks, it's a five-minute round, and I'm going to say to those who are answering questions, I know that sometimes answers can take almost half of that time, so there may be some interruptions here. I'm going to ask a few questions. First, the 70, I guess this would be to the mayor. How do you plan to fund the recommendations of Reopen DC?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So we have in the initial tranche that has been awarded from the federal government, the $495 million, we have We have big buckets that we have dedicated, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that. I'm looking for my slide. That is slide 33. And our initial costs have involved our hospital assistance grants, our contact tracing and increased testing, $223 million for our public safety frontline workers, and healthcare contracts. All of those things are helping us respond, but also will help us reopen. We have also put aside $158 million to support the cost of reopening. Again, we think those are initial costs, and we have budgeted what we have, but we have also anticipated what we and how we would spend the additional $775 million that is owed to us from the federal government. And which is why we have been working so hard to have that additional fund. Because we know, we believe that there are things that we can do to ease the business community coming back, including working on how we can have a local supply of PPE and sanitation equipment, how we can look forward to build outs that will make spaces safer, any additional IT support, for example, that would be necessary. Public spaces and alterations to public spaces can be also used with the additional funds. And finally, Mr. Chairman, we're prepared and preparing for a second wave should that happen. We know that any reopening will generate more cases. And we need to make sure that all of our preparations account for a second wave.
Thank you. Can you speak for a minute about the plan for this new Foxhall School and where it will be?
Sure. We've been working very closely, DCPS, the Ward 3 community groups, around how we address some of the, some people say crowding, I say over demand. There's a lot of demand for schools. And one suggestion from DCPS has been a new elementary school. And it will be on the campus of the old Hardy School. The school that's there currently will continue to operate, and the green space on the campus is where a new school will be built.
Thank you. And I think I have a little over a minute left. The $76 million to rehabilitate public housing, so those are new dollars. And this is, I just want to say, if I understand this correctly, this is where the district government is stepping in due to the disinvestment from the federal government in public housing. Are there additional dollars available, or is this the total of what you're proposing for public housing? And I don't mean in that to imply it's not enough.
Yes, I understand. And let me say a couple of words, and then I'm going to ask Jenny to step in. You may recall, Mr. Chairman, that I asked CFO DeWitt to work with the Housing Authority on assessing the needs of the Housing Authority. The executive director came to us, and I believe to you and the Housing Committee as well, about a plan for rehab needed at the Housing Authority. We believed that it needed an assessment similar to the assessment that the CFO completed for us of WMATA, long-term investments. And CFO DeWitt has worked with them and is in that process now, although I don't think complete. That's still in review. But we felt comfortable advancing this $76 million, recognizing that a complete review, making sure that the project could be complete, would be done. In this budget, you also see a new way to operate those dollars, which will allow us to work hand in hand with the CFO on how those dollars are getting out the door and being efficiently used. And it's called the DASH Fund. And I'm going to ask Jenny to talk a little bit more about that, the $76 million and all of the other housing investments.
Briefly, because we're over my time.
Okay. Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, Chairman. I'll be very brief. So the 76 million includes 2 tranches of funding for our public housing portfolio. 40 million of that will be used for a new pot of funding for state of good repair for the rehab and development of our public housing units, and 36 million will be to continue to support our new communities program that's redeveloping 4 public housing properties across the city. In fiscal year 2021, there'll be 25 million available for that small cap sort of type rehab and rehabilitation of the public housing portfolio. And then we're also very excited that the 21 budget continues the mayor's landmark investment of $100 million into the Housing Production Trust Fund. It includes $1 million in the Preservation Fund and nearly 20 million to help low-income home buyers and first-time home buyers buy homes in DC.
Thank you. Councilmember Schaefer, questions?
Yes, thank you. And I want to thank the mayor and her team and the CFO and all the folks who have put this together. I think that overall we have a sensible, well-crafted, creative, and sensitive budget under the circumstances. As others have noted, you know, this budget period and next we have over $700 million in each to account for. And so the way this was put together, especially the way we've used our reserves, and I want to do a little editorial about that. I want to thank the chairman and my colleagues and you, Mayor. Over the past years, we've been very careful to build up those reserves for when we needed them, despite the fact that we've often had calls to use those monies for other purposes. And now I think people will appreciate why it was vital that we did that. And using those and federal monies and you know, the way we put the budget together, you put the budget together, Mayor, we're still able to finance important things like housing and increase the per pupil funding in schools and so on. So I want to focus on a few things that are of immediate importance to me. You know, I'm very, very happy and grateful about the advances that we're going to have, you know, in hospital care, clinic care, you know, in the east end of the city for health equity. But I want to talk about something that we don't always focus on, and it's probably a mistake not to focus on it more, and that is nutrition. If we're going to have health equity, we have to have nutrition equity. And the connection between good nutrition, access to good food, food stores, nutrition education, we're losing a valuable way to ensure health equity. One of the things in this budget I'm happy about in that regard is that the budget does maintain funding for things like Produce Plus, Produce RX, Healthy Corners, Joyful Markets, Food and Friends, and other things of that nature. However, I'm a little concerned to see that about $2 million was taken out of OSSI's school wellness programs, and it looks like it may have stripped out all of the Healthy Schools Act grants and increased reimbursements for breakfast from the Healthy Students Amendment Act. I'm very concerned about any reductions that affect the ability of our residents to have access and education about good nutrition, because many of the ills that our residents face can be directly traced to issues about nutrition. So I want to ask Mayor if, you know, what the thinking was there, and whether, you know, there's some substitute that I'm missing in this budget that would make up for these losses.
Mary and Councilmember Che, and certainly I agree with you that we have been very focused on food and the investments that you mentioned we know are being particularly effective in making sure that children are being educated, families are being educated, that we're supporting nonprofits who have been very effective in working with communities, and even during our pandemic response, are working with communities. We did, however, in every category across our budget, look for things that may have been duplicative in some way, may be served by another function, or may even be part of an enhancement in benefits from the federal government. So I'm going to ask the CA and Jenny to talk specifically about the food, this food focuses in the budget.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So Councilmember Che, just to put it in a little context, we've in the district, as a result of this pandemic and really focusing on nutrition and food, have delivered about 400,000 meals to date. We average about 55,000 persons served a week from DCPS. And so that doesn't include our senior feeding as well. So we really have been focused on nutrition and food and making sure that people have what they need in that regard. In terms of specifically what's in the OSSI budget, as the mayor indicated, we had to make very difficult trade-offs, and because we actually didn't get a chance to start the breakfast reimbursement program due to the pandemic, we were preparing to gear that program up, and then we, as you obviously are aware, had students working from home, so we never launched that program. And as we looked to where we could make these reductions that we had to make, we carried that forward to fiscal year 21. Jenny, I don't know if there's anything else to add to that. No, okay.
Am I out of my first round, Mr. Chairman?
Yes, yes, you are. Your time's expired. Councilmember McDuffie?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Madam Mayor, CFO DeWitt, City Administrator Rashad, and your teams for all your hard work on this. Rather than go through the entire statement I had prepared, I think I'm just going to talk about some of the things that I appreciate. I mean, I know that you all were faced with, I think, one of an unprecedented crisis in financial constraints that we haven't seen in a really long time in the city. And so I appreciate the challenges was trying to put together a balanced budget under those conditions, and want to really commend you all for doing so. I appreciate some of the things that you were able to include in this budget that benefits Ward 5 residents. And I want to highlight a couple of those. I think there are investments in infrastructure improvements, pedestrian safety, environmental upgrades that are noteworthy. I really appreciate and want to hear more from you about the investment to renovate Spingarn High School and expand workforce development programs to the Infrastructure Academy. I want to highlight the $1.5 million for the expansion of school-based mental health programs, which I think is critically important, and really appreciate that. A 3% increase in the per pupil funding formula, substantial investments in early childhood education across schools in Ward 5 and other parts of the district, and continued investment to support renovation and modernization of rec centers and schools, including Langdon Park Recreation Center, Brown and Burroughs schools. Now, I do have some concerns though. In particular, the Clean Rivers Impervious Area Charge. You all know that many faith-based institutions have been hit hard by COVID-19 and have not really been able to tap into some of the emergency resources like other organizations and individuals have. So I'm troubled by the reduction of $3.8 million in the CREAC Relief Fund. I'm also troubled by the 11.4% cut in the Office of Neighborhood Safety and Engagement, which amounts to about more than $800,000. And I'll note that the Attorney General's Public Safety Division experienced a reduction of $2.1 million, which I think also will hit the NERAC's violence prevention programs as well. And so I want to highlight those. And I want to also note that I was disappointed that we didn't see any investments in the Ivy City recreational opportunities that we included in our letter to you, Madam Mayor. I'll note that my letter was sent to you prior to the outbreak of this pandemic. Nonetheless, there's some important priorities that I think I'm going to have to work with my colleagues to try to prioritize that were not addressed in the budget. And so if I could, in what limited time, and I've got a big picture of the chairman, but I don't see a clock on here. See how much time I have left. If I could ask Madam Mayor, City Administrator, if you all can talk about the cuts in the Office of Neighborhood Safety and Engagement and the reductions in the Attorney General's program. How is this going to impact the city's violence prevention and intervention programs that are being implemented throughout the District of Columbia, in particular in wards 5, 7, and 8?
Thank you, Mr. McDuffie. So let me start by saying that we have been very focused on the Office of Neighborhood Safety and Engagement, and with your partnership have continued to look for ways for them to expand in neighborhoods across the district. We've also had an opportunity to step back and see what's working best. And we know that the Pathways program is working best. And we also know that a model that we invested in last year at Anacostia School that pairs violence interrupters with school staff is working very well. And we're going to invest in additional teams to do exactly that. I'm going to ask the CA to talk about the specific dollars, but our focus is.
And just before you speak, City Administrator, if I could just say, if you could also let me know if you all have thought about any efficiencies that might be created in this programming by consolidating efforts between the Office of the Attorney General and the Office of Neighborhood Safety and Engagement within the executive. I know there have been conversations generally that have been mentioned. I think one of our more recent Mayor Council breakfast meetings, it was also discussed by the AG. I think Charles Allen may have talked about it a bit. So, Mr. City Administrator, my time is expired, but if you could answer that and just also talk about whether there's been any discussions on consolidating those programs.
Quickly, Mr. City Administrator, because you can't really ask a question after the time's expired. We're all on a rough clock. Mr. City Administrator.
Okay, for Office of Neighborhood Safety and Engagement, I'll be quick. As the mayor indicated, what we're really trying to do is focus on those programs where we know they have the greatest returns. And so we emphasize the Pathways program in that regard and emphasize this model that we've stood up in Anacostia High School. And we hope to expand those to 2 additional schools in fiscal 21 using federal resources. So you will see that local budget reduction, but we will be making investments through federal resources in the expansion of that neighborhood school intervention model. One of the other tough things about 21 for the Office of Neighborhood Safety and Engagement is that one-time funds were added in fiscal year 20 for expansion of violence interruption in communities. And so it's been really difficult for us to be able to sustain funding in 21 for things that were funded one time, which made that difficult, why we had to make the difficult decision to make that reduction. And then that will lead to a rescoping of those violence interruption contracts to make sure that we can have appropriate coverage in the neighborhoods that need them. In terms of CURE and it's in Office of Attorney General and the Office of Neighborhood Safety and Engagement, I think there certainly could be greater efficiencies if those programs are located in one place. However, I think we also have to look at the efficacy of both programs because they have a different model. And which model prevails or is the most appropriate for abating violent crime in our communities. And I think there has to be that strategic discussion about which course we're going to pursue as we have further discussions about where that program lives within the executive. Happy to come back to CREAC on round 2.
Yes. Let me remind everybody who's attending, there is a clock and gallery view in the top left, I believe. So everybody can be mindful of what the time is. Councilmember Bonds, 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chairman. And my special thanks to Mayor Bowser and her team for what I say is a budget that I think all of us can appreciate given the circumstances under which we are trying to move our government and our city forward. I especially appreciate the affordable housing, public housing, senior resources that are in the budget, and I appreciate the planned new rental assistance dollars that I feel will complement the existing ERAP program. So I want to thank you very much for that. However, I was hoping for new monies for the expansion of cooperatives and the opportunity to provide some of the cooperatives with some of the technical and educational needs that they have. So I hope we'll have an opportunity to talk more about that later. But I do have just two questions. One, now that Trump, our president, says he will transmit this $876 million to WMATA, does this decrease the DC's contractual payment to WMATA? That's one question. I see Mr. City Administrator, he knew it was coming. I've been on this point for some time. And then secondly, I wanted to talk a little bit about reopening. I have a question about that, and I'll put it out there now since I only have a few minutes. The question is, how will our businesses, our buildings, how will they pay for cleaning and disinfecting of the common areas, particularly since I think with the reopening committee, there's some guidelines that we put together that stipulated that the cleaning needs to occur daily, that even workstations need to be cleaned daily. And so one of the questions that came from the group is, so how do we pay for these supplies? And so if I could get some response to that, I would appreciate it. But thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Madam Council Member. And I should say that, what's today, Tuesday? On Thursday, we will be presenting, or the committee is going to present their recommendations to me. And I mentioned earlier that one thing that we're working on now in the EOC is if we can create a local stockpile, if you will, that may be that our businesses may be able to tap into, especially on the initial phase of reopening. And we may be able to do that at no cost using the emergency fund or at small cost. So we're working on that now. The issue for that, we've already contemplated budget amounts. What we're doing now is making sure that the supply chains are making those things available and that we can spend our personnel and expertise procuring them. And we also have to make sure that our medical surge is still served. If we have any surge of hospital usage now or in the fall. So we're trying to balance all of those things. Oh, and DC government, by the way. The same things that businesses are concerned about, we have a concern in our own buildings as well. So we are working on that. What can we do to help with an initial phase, medical surge, and DC government buildings?
And does that mean with the stockpile that the supplies will be complementary to these entities that you mentioned, or will there be a fee for these items?
Well, Council Member, we haven't designed the program yet, and as soon as we're more firm in how many of the supplies that we can get, we will be able, and it may be that we have to prioritize sectors who would have access to the supplies. You know, you guys are working on 11 different sectors. It may be that we have to prioritize the sectors, or it may be that we can support early phase and not late phase, but it would not be forever. So we would see our ability to support in the early phases of reopening, and we want our businesses, even right now, thinking about how they're going to do that for the long haul.
Thank you.
For bonds, Councilmember Grasso.
Well, thank you, Chairman Mendelson. Also, thank you to the mayor, to the city administrator, to the CFO. I personally do not have any questions today, but I do want to share a few thoughts. This past winter, as I do every year, I sent my annual budget letter covering what I've seen as the biggest needs in our city, and that is made public as it always is. And this past year, I again focused on education, and I've been encouraged, of course, by the academic growth of our students, especially during the past few years. However, the academic outcomes of our Black and Latinx students and those who are economically disadvantaged are far below those of our peers who are white and whose families are more economically secure. While DC has made gains through our school reform efforts, we cannot claim success until these gaps are completely eliminated. We must continue to increase our investments in high quality education in the District of Columbia. As chairperson of the Committee on Education, I have spoken with many students and teachers about the need for additional supports, particularly those focused on restorative practices and on mental health. This is why I advocated in my letter for a 4% increase in the universal per student funding formula to improve mental health supports for our students and to provide trauma-informed training for all of our teachers and administrators. Prior to COVID-19, I looked forward to working with you all on those investments. With the changing economic landscape, I am even more steadfast in my belief that we must double down on education. The loss of instruction time, social isolation, and economic stress caused by the ongoing coronavirus public health emergency threatens to reverse the progress we have made and indeed widen the achievement gap. Research has shown that social isolation can be tough on children generally. Just 10 days of quarantine measures can negatively impact an individual's emotional well-being, with the recovery period taking weeks or even months. When living in impoverished conditions and experiencing a high amount of trauma, those challenges are even tougher. As we face this new reality and its negative impacts on our students, I am extremely pleased to see the FY21 budget proposal include a 3% increase that enables us to better meet these challenges and put our students in the best position to succeed. As we move forward in this budget process, I look forward to the discussion with the education sector leaders on how this budget addresses the real possibility that much of the next school year will need to be held virtually. Questions around professional development for teachers, our technology infrastructure, and most importantly, our ability to address trauma students are facing from being disconnected from their peers are things that I am deeply concerned about. But I'd also like to acknowledge today the capital investments in the District of Columbia Public Libraries in this budget. I did request in my budget letter that we invest in a standalone Parklands Turner Public Library, and I am pleased to see that the investment for the Congress Heights neighborhood is there. I also think it's important that we invest in the Chevy Chase Library, as it has long been neglected as well. So I want to reiterate my gratitude for the hard work that has been done here. I think the priorities that you've put out there on continuing the work that we've done in education and making sure that the reform efforts that we've started can continue are vitally important. I also want to say that investing continually in early childhood literacy, making sure that school-based mental health continues to grow so that we can continue to address the adversity and trauma our students face is a big priority of mine, and I am glad to see it in this budget. So thank you all for your hard work. I don't have any questions. I literally just wanted to take this time to say thank you for addressing the educational needs of our city, and I look forward to continuing to work with you and my colleagues through this budget process. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Grasso. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Silverman, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mayor Bowser, CFO DeWitt, City Administrator Young, and Budget Director Reed, thank you for your hard work, and please stay safe. We need you healthy. On to my questions. Labor representatives have contacted my committee with concerns about the proposal to not pay agreed upon cost of living increases in 3 collective collective bargaining agreements. This includes the COLA for comp units 1 and 2, which has over 10,000 district employees and represents workers in essential DC government jobs like our trash haulers and DPW. So the first concern is that this is a negotiated contract. So I want to be clear in what you are asking in this budget. Are you asking the council to change the contract by passing a law in the BSA to eliminate COLAs in these agreements?
You want to talk about the language, CA?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Mayor. Councilmember Silverman, we are in fact through the BSA asking the council to set aside those negotiated agreements in the 4th year of compensation units 1 and 2, DBH, SCIU, and AFSCME Local 2921, and institute a wage freeze. And quite frankly, the $49 million that that represents in fiscal year 21 and the $250 million throughout the plan for all employees have helped us preserve jobs across the district, where we otherwise would have most certainly and definitely had furloughs and layoffs.
City Administrator, have the unions involved, AFSCME and AFGE, I think there's an SEIU, have they agreed to this wage freeze?
They have not. They have not agreed to that. I have talked with each of the labor unions in comp units 1 and 2, and that's represented by AFSCME, AFGE, and NAGE about our plan. I've talked to leadership in SCIU 1199, and one of the same leaders represents 2921. So I have talked to them about all of this, but I wouldn't say at this point they've told me they agree.
Were other options considered? Because you're freezing it for the entire CBA. Like, were options considered to just freeze it for example, FY21, and then make it contingent, let's say if we have economic recovery to...
So all options were considered. All options were considered as we work to balance the budget in 21 through the financial plan. We will also submit BSA language, and I talked to those union leaders about this too, that prioritize paying those agreements should our revenue forecast change. And we did consider options before we got to the point of asking our labor partners to accept this. And just again, quite frankly, the alternative here would be significant employee reductions and furloughs across the government.
Okay. I want to move on to the Infrastructure Academy. Madam Mayor, as you know, I'm very supportive of the concept of the Infrastructure Academy, but we need to make sure that the concept meets the reality. The concept, just for the public, is that this facility will train our workers for good living wage jobs in one of our biggest industry sectors, infrastructure. We're talking about jobs at Pepco, Metro, Washington Gas, IT, and so forth. The Academy was put in Ward 8 to make it easily accessible to residents who have the highest need for living wage employment. And though COVID certainly has increased unemployment across the city, my guess is that it's still highest in our wards east of the river. So a two-part question. What was the process for making the decision to move the Academy out of Wilkinson? And can you tell me the process to decide upon Spingarn as the new location?
Yes, and in the materials I shared with the council yesterday, we talked about actually 3 moves that involve how we educate and train our residents. And we have, council member, for some time not been satisfied with the setup at Wilkinson. We went in there with a short amount of notice and investment, and the building, quite frankly, just hasn't served us well. So we would need to make a considerable investment in that building to make it work. And we thought, looking at all of our needs, that it would be better used as a school use. So that's our decision, to have it used as a school use. Spingarn, on the other hand, has been shuttered for too many years. It's a large building. It is centrally located. It is well served by transit, and I think easily accessible from wards 5, 7, and 8, and the entire city. So we can make the type of improvements that we need to that building to support an infrastructure academy that we envisioned several years ago. But as we look forward to what our workforce needs will be moving forward, we also have the opportunity to craft it post COVID-19 to serve our workforce needs. It's a large building, as you may know. If you haven't been to Spingarn, it's very similar to our other high schools of that era. And we think it is also an opportunity to leverage capital investment from a partner. More than likely a charter school that would bring their own financing to use part of the building that they could invest their capital dollars in and possibly be a tenant, a paying tenant. So that's the thought process behind it.
Okay, thank you. I'm gonna-
Councilmember Nadeau, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Mayor, for all of your work on this budget and what is obviously a very, very difficult year. And I want to also thank you for preserving investments in Ward 1. Your budget includes $5 million towards new permanent supportive housing units. Is there someone who could walk me through how many units this will include in the breakdown for singles and families?
Sure. Jenny will address your question.
Thank you.
Hi, council member. The breakdown for the 5 million will include 96 units of permanent supportive housing for individuals and 54 units of new permanent supportive housing for families.
And are these units on top of what was funded in the FY20 budget?
That is correct, yes.
Okay. And I want to say thank you for the major investment in FRSP, Mayor. And I saw there's an enhancement of funding for rapid rehousing for families at 9.2 million, but I didn't see enhancement for individuals. Is that correct?
Jenny?
Yes, that's correct. The focus is on families, as we currently have more families seeking the rapid rehousing assistance and needing to stay longer currently right now because they can't move out with the public health emergency going on.
I see. So for some of that's continuation of existing subsidy.
Some of it is to meet the increased need for the rental costs that we're seeing in the city. Some is for what we anticipate to be a longer demand, and some is to make some of the improvements that the working group that I know were part of discussed, like providing some bridge programming for families while we see and assess if maybe they're better candidates for permanent supportive housing.
I see. Okay, so back to individuals for a moment. My concern is whether we have enough funding to sufficiently reduce density in shelters in the fall and winter. We're going to see, I assume we're going to keep seeing shelter numbers balloon as people feel the sustained impact of the economic recession and also dealing with the uptick in COVID-19 cases and the onset of flu season. So I'm concerned it's not enough. And I wanted to see if we have, maybe that committee has made some recommendations as the Reopen committee has made some recommendations on how we're moving people from their COVID shelter status, whether it's congregate or hotels, and into permanent housing.
So we will be able to address, and we do contemplate emergency funds, COVID related, to go into the season. Currently, our guidance is that we can use those funds through the end of this year, calendar year.
Okay. Okay. And is any of that allowable for permanent housing, or is that strictly for the hotels and the shelters?
Well, that, you know, Councilmember Che said we were creative. So that may require some creative thinking.
I am all for it. I'm all for it. Thank you for that. I also wanted to touch on the Solid Foundations plan to end youth homelessness. I've been so proud of the district's commitment to fully funding this plan over the past several years. I saw there are a couple of minor cuts and one substantial cut to homeless services continuum youth line item of $1.569 million. Are there federal funds that will offset this reduction, or otherwise how is programming going to be impacted?
Council member, so there are no change to the youth programs in the DHS budget. The reductions that you see are reductions in the family, youth, and individual buckets related just to the contractual services. So we worked with DHS along with every agency to really identify efficiencies in contracts that we can achieve without interrupting services. And that's what the youth line relates to.
Okay. I don't think I can get another question in 20 seconds, so I will go ahead and yield back my time and come back to you all. Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Director.
Thank you, Councilmember.
Councilmember, could I add one thing to Councilmember? And it also, I think, somewhat addresses what Councilmember Silverman said. Keep in mind that we'll be back at this again next year, working on the fiscal 22 budget. And some of the things that you've mentioned, we will have the opportunity, hopefully, we will see our numbers improve in the priorities that you mentioned, priorities of working with our employees in DC government is very important to me. I mentioned yesterday how we keep our team together. The folks that are working for us, part of the represented team and the unrepresented team who are going to give up some pay increases, but they'll keep their jobs. And that is very important. So when we come back to do this again next year, be assured that we're going to try to correct those things. And I mentioned that also too for in the things that you mentioned around homelessness and housing. We still have big plans to continue those investments, and we'll revisit them next year.
Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, Councilmember Allen, for 5-minute questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, Madam Mayor and City Administrator and everybody else. First off, I definitely want to thank you and your team for a lot of hard work to put this budget together, and obviously extremely challenging times. I'm sure most of your staff hasn't known what a weekend is for quite some time. So really much appreciate all the hard work that's gone into this. Certainly, we'll have questions and issues around different policy proposals, but that doesn't take away from just a recognition of the hard work that's gone into this. So really appreciate everybody working so hard to do this. I wanted to have a couple of questions, but briefly wanted to speak about one issue. I think I've heard, we've all talked about in this budget presentation and the sacrifices that we're all going to have to make, and I completely agree. I think district residents are truly sacrificing a lot right now, and I know that many of my own constituents are hurting. And as we've talked about, the impacts of COVID are uneven and they are unequal across our city, with a very striking disparity hitting our most vulnerable residents in very devastating ways. On the other hand, we definitely have some families that are able to telework. They've got all the devices and Wi-Fi that they need. They've got secure housing. They've got access to recreation and outdoor spaces, and they don't really stress about whether they have access to fresh food or not. So I want to make sure that as we see so many of our working class residents have their livelihoods crumble around them, and our own government employees that are being asked to forego pay and COLA increases, and as essential workers from hospital staff to bus drivers to grocery store clerks are working with the constant fear of infection, and basically they're all sacrificing, I think we should also be asking for sacrifices from those households that are least impacted by this, those who are going to be able to more easily weather the storm. A few years ago, we gave an income tax cut to all district residents based on recommendations from our tax commission. And we timed that, of course, to occur when we had the revenue to pay for those cuts. And while the cuts were certainly progressive, a significant benefit went to wealthy households. And now that we're again making sacrifices in what is truly an unprecedented time, I'd like to work with my colleagues and everybody else to ensure that we all pay our fair and equitable share. At least those earning more than $350,000 are top earners. And I believe that we should also then trigger those to bring those taxes back down once we're clear of the economic crisis and we once again have the revenue to pay for that tax cut. These households can afford a slight bump in taxes that could add millions of dollars that could be used for lifelines to programs like emergency rental assistance, domestic violence shelters, lawyers for our lowest income residents to protect the rights we've been given them in our COVID bills, violence prevention programming in the middle of a homicide crisis. I'm really concerned that we're going to hit a cliff in the months ahead with this pandemic. And all those folks that are on payment plans or have rent deferred, they're going to find themselves facing financial ruin. And so I hope that we can all work on this in the weeks and months to come. I want to turn very quickly to a couple of questions specifically within the Committee on Judiciary and Public Safety. I want to thank you again for a lot of the investments being made, but I also know that we share a deep concern around gun violence in the city and violent crime, and we've worked together to try to come up with a lot of strategies to work on that. It almost feels like we essentially have two public health crises going at the same time, the virus as well as gun violence. I know that as of this morning, we're essentially unchanged from last year's to date in terms of homicides at 55. So I wanted to ask a little bit about the Office of Neighborhood Safety Engagement, and I heard Mr. Young talk about some federal dollars, so I'd like to get a little more details about that. But one of the programs that I agree with you and have been deeply impressed with is our Pathways program. And so I wanted to ask, does the funding that is in this year's budget, which it sounds like Mr. Young may be both a combination of local and federal funds, will it really fund the 4 cohorts of Pathways program classes that we had planned for this fiscal year?
Sorry, I was just unmuting. So the budget for fiscal year 21 makes no changes to the number of Pathways participants that we were able to move through. So that program will serve the same number of people over the same number of cohorts.
Okay, that's great to hear. Thank you. And I also want to ask about the Anacostia Leadership Academy. I've gotten nothing but high praise and really great feedback about that investment and the work that's being done there. Really having support professionals, incredible messengers to work with vulnerable young people. And obviously before the crisis had hit, we had talked about wanting to recommend this be expanded to a second high school. And what I wasn't quite sure, because again, on the local budget, it looks like a reduction of about $400,000, but I heard you again say that you're looking for some federal dollars to help supplement that. Is the combination of local and federal dollars going to maintain the Anacostia High School program, or are we able to start scaling this really successful program to be able to add in an additional high school this coming year?
So Councilmember, we anticipate being able to add 2 additional high schools.
Excellent.
In addition to Anacostia through the federal funding. It is the GEAR program. Don't ask me to tell you what the acronym is as I sit here. I'm sure Director Reed knows. But we're hoping to be able to get to 3 schools in 21, including Anacostia.
Okay, thank you. And I know I'm already out of time, so I'll just flag one quick issue. I know with the Office of Victim Services and Justice Grants, this is an area that does so much for a lot of our direct service providers around the city, which I think we're going to be leaning on them even more so than we already do this coming year and in the months ahead. So I know that it looks like their budget is going to be reduced from local funds, and we also have an elimination of our place-based trauma centers. So I would like to work with you and others to see what we can do to help find or identify other resources. I think that's an area that we really need to continue the investment. I know these are tough decisions, and I take nothing away from the fact that you had a lot of difficult decisions in front of you to put this budget together, but just want to highlight that's one area that I'd like to work over the coming weeks so that we can start to put some of the resources back into OVSJG for all the vulnerable communities that they're going to be working and serving for. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Madam Mayor, if I could just respond back to that, Councilmember Allen. So there is an error, and Mr. Chairman and members, you will get a letter from us in the next coming days. When you do 2 budgets and reconstruct them in a number of weeks, sometimes you miss some things. So in OVSJG's case, there was a reduction of $500,000 to their grants. That was an error that we will correct, and so we want to put that back. And then from the trauma-based centers, we went from 3 centers, what was planned for 3 centers, and we're going to 1. So we'll still be able to establish one of those trauma-based centers in fiscal 21.
Okay, Mr. City Administrator, I appreciate the clarification on that. Look forward to that. And even with that, still
Mr. Allen,
working with you in the weeks ahead.
Sure.
Your time's expired. Councilmember
Thanks, Rashad.
Councilmember Todd, 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mayor Bowser and City Administrator Young and CFO DeWitt for your presentation today. And thank you for presenting us with a balanced budget that makes big investments in education, in school modernizations, in public facilities like libraries and recreation centers, in affordable housing, and in public safety. I was very pleased to see the increase in the cadet program, to take that program from 100 to 150 cadets. There's not one day that a Ward 4 resident is not talking to me about public safety and how we can do more to increase the number of officers we have within the District of Columbia. Mayor, I do have a question. Currently, the district stay-at-home order is until June the 8th. Should we have to extend that stay-at-home order, how would another extension affect the budget that we have before us today?
Well, I hope we don't have to do that, council member, but how it would affect this budget, I think that we have included all of the orders in the CFO's revenue estimate and in the supplemental for 2020 that is before you. So I don't think that an extension of the stay-at-home order, let me just say this, the shorter the stay-at-home order is, the better for this budget. Because it means when people are able to get out, then they're starting the economy. It is not good, however, if people try to go back to life pre-pandemic, because it will make it harder for us to stay open in the fall, if that makes sense. So what I would say is, the success of our phased reopening in this current fiscal year, FY20, affects us to the good in FY21. So it would mean then that our recovery could be faster.
Okay, thank you for that, Mayor. And I also hear from a number of Ward 4 child care providers, and I know you talked a little bit about that at a recent press conference, that are facing uncertain futures, and many of these are private child care providers. Does this budget continue to pay subsidies to DC child care providers regardless of attendance numbers?
Yes, and council member, I'm going to have Jenny talk a little bit more about that. We did have child care providers that applied for the micro grants. We have continued to pay subsidy to other child care providers. And this budget is looking post-pandemic about how we continue to fund seats for early child care and 0 to 3 programs throughout the district. Part of what we've done, although we've had to make some tough choices, getting on the other side of this pandemic from an economic perspective means families have to go back to work. They have to have reliable child care. And we know how much the child care issue falls to moms, quite frankly. No offense against dads, but women have been also disproportionately impacted by this crisis as it relates to child care. So getting child care back is hugely important. And I've also asked our team to contemplate that in reopen discussions for any additional support or relief as we think about businesses reopening. Jenny?
Thank you, Mayor. Yes, and in the current fiscal year, we have continued to pay our child care providers the subsidy that they were receiving before the public health crisis hit to make sure that they can keep their businesses going and their workers employed. We also received $6 million in additional federal funds that's helping us continue those payments, and in some cases providing some enhanced payments to providers who are staying open to help serve our emergency and essential workers. And then in the upcoming budget, we are also investing significant dollars in our capital budget to open up more than 540 0 to 3 seats in 17 schools across DC neighborhoods. We know that for child care facilities, one of the biggest financial barriers they face is facility and space. And so we will be building that out as we modernize some schools or adding additions to some schools, and then allowing those nonprofits to come in and operate our facilities so that we can have more seats for families right in their neighborhoods and available to them.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I think I'm about out of time.
Thank you, Councilmember Todd. Councilmember Robert White for 5 minutes.
Mayor, I want to thank you and your team, CFO DeWitt, for all of your work during what is an incredibly difficult budget year. I do want to ask about a few things. Well, first, I want to commend your commitment to education, the 3% increase in the per pupil funding. The early childhood education seats, I think, are a very strong step forward, and I want to associate myself with the remarks of Councilmember Grasso. I've also been hearing a lot from teachers about concerns for the mental health of their students, and that is something that I think we recognize we will have to pay attention to as we look to reopen schools and close the opportunity gap. On the issue of crime, I am very glad to see the continuation of the Pathways program. As Councilmember Allen mentioned, I think it's very strong, and glad to hear about the expansion of the Leadership Academy. What I don't understand, though, is the cut to the Office of Neighborhood Safety and Engagement. Was there data indicating sort of a lack of success with that program that pushed you to cut it?
I will ask the city administrator to talk about the specific line items, but I think what we want to emphasize is that we think most effective is when you match outreach with programs and supports, and that's what happens in the Pathways program, and that's what's also happening in the Leadership Academies. And that this budget and before you reflects our emphasis on those things.
Councilmember White, what I would say is just when you look at the Pathways program, for example, and you're able to track those individuals and their success and progress once they leave the Pathways program, the evidence seems to be very clear about their lack of recidivism, their employment in many cases, and less interactions with police and law enforcement. In the case of violence interruption, the data is a little bit mixed. And so we have violence interrupters that are in communities where we haven't seen the kinds of declines in violent crime that we would like. But we know that they're just one point of inflection in terms of how we deal with that issue. And so it would be unfair to say that they're all solely responsible for being able to pull those numbers down, but the linkage is less there. And so that's one aspect. But the other piece, I think, in terms of the budget, that's really important to understand, and I go back to that point where in fiscal year 20, there was $400,000 added as one-time resources. The executive reprogrammed an additional $400,000 to expand violence interruption, and that's just very difficult to sustain in 2021, given the magnitude of reductions that we had to make. So there are really two things happening here. One is sort of we want to invest where the data suggests we're most impactful, and two, continuing one-time funding was just really a challenge in order to make the budget balance.
All right. Well, let me just kind of reflect my concern. I think the program, Office of Neighborhood and Safety Engagement, is still very early, perhaps too early to cut as opposed to look to improve. So my hope is that the council will engage in that program and work with the administration to see if there are ways to improve and indeed expand it. And because of the level of crime right now, I think that's something that we have to look very hard at. In the Office of in OCP, it appears that the Office of Contract and Procurement's large IT project, the Ariba refresh, looks like it's been canceled. And the Ariba system was OCP's plan to move to fully digital contracting and away from the 10-year-old software that my understanding is it will not be supported any longer by the supplier after this year. So OCP has indicated to the council over the past couple of years that the Ariba refresh is particularly important because it will allow OCP to comply with our contracting transparency laws and improve oversight. So the refresh project started 2 years ago, but I don't see funding for it now. Has it been canceled? And if so, do we just lose the money that we spent already?
So we don't lose the investment in the sense that there had been a lot of work in planning for the refresh. We did put the Ariba and Pass refresh on hold, but it's also important to put that into context. At the same time we were moving forward with Ariba refresh, the CFO was moving forward with a wholesale replacement of SOAR in our financial system. And we were trying to figure out a way to do both of these significant IT projects, which really have to be integrated well for the enterprise financial system to work. We were trying to figure out how to do those on a path that made sense. And so we decided to put the pause on Ariba because we had to cut $1.2 billion out of the capital project, but we were increasingly concerned about the ability to integrate these two projects in a way that lessened the risk for us in deploying two major financial systems at the same time in a parallel process. And so part of this also is risk mitigation. If we had not removed that project out of the CIP, what you would have seen from the executive is for us to make some pretty dramatic changes to the pace and the scale of Ariba because of the need to integrate and upgrade, the need to upgrade SOAR first. If the financial system isn't fully deployed, then everything that touches that financial system will be a disaster. So we were going to make wholesale changes to the pace of Ariba regardless.
Thank you very much, Madam Mayor, Mr. Young. Thank you, Chairman.
Councilmember Vincent Gray. Councilmember Gray, you're still muted.
Sorry about that.
We can hear you. No, you managed to mute yourself again.
How's that?
Can be heard.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam Mayor, I want to join my colleagues in extending congratulations to you and also to City Administrator Rashad Young and the CFO Jeff DeWitt for really being able to put together a budget that we clearly can work with. It's incredibly commendable for you to put together a document that reflects the realities of what we're dealing with at this point. It's got some very sound fundamentals and some good approaches, I would say, having been around this for a while in terms of what's necessary to be able to put together a budget. I also want to commend you on how you've used the fund balance, which was, as you alluded to earlier, worked very hard on over time to be able to get to this point. And frankly, also being able to preserve some of our fund balance at this stage in the event that, and we hope we won't, but in the event that we face a situation in which we will need more, more resources to dip into because this situation hasn't completely gotten resolved. I just want to add to the following, Madam Mayor, and then I have a couple of questions to ask you about that. I was really ecstatic to see that $83+ million had been added to the new hospital system project, and brings the funding now to, I think, slightly a little more than, looks like $383+ million. And as you well know, it goes a long way towards funding a huge priority of mine, and that is to be able to create a real healthcare system for both Ward 7 and Ward 8 on the east end of the city. That would include a state-of-the-art community hospital, would include ambulatory care services, would include 2 urgent care centers, which is a huge step forward. Never been anything like that on the east end of the city. And as you know, we have seen some shocking COVID-19 death rates in our African-American communities here in the District of Columbia, and frankly, across the country. we know that some of the conditions, the COVID-19 conditions that have been experienced in Ward 7 and Ward 8 and other places around the country are attributable to health disparities that exist. So I wonder if you could speak, Madam Mayor, to what the additional $83 million that I alluded to in this budget, which I really appreciate,
Ambulatory.
will what will that money be used for? The construction of this new healthcare system that we are moving towards.
Well, thank you for that, Mr. Gray. I want to thank you and also congratulate you. I know this has been your focus since coming back to the council on building a state-of-the-art hospital. We've also all collectively been focused on how we're going to get the district out of the hospital business, and that's why we were very proud to be able to announce a partnership with George Washington Hospital, which is going to be very important. We have worked over the last year since the council last took this up on that partnership, but also making sure that the hospital isn't the only thing we're doing, but an ambulatory care center, which will also be constructed first, as well as other urgent care. So I'm going to ask the CA to talk about the lines of service, as well as the other parts of this care system to the hospital.
Thank you for that, Mayor, and thank you, Councilmember Gray, for your leadership and focus on this as well. The primary addition here is the ambulatory center that the mayor has talked about as a part of the hospital campus. And so there's going to be an inpatient tower, if you will, and then the ambulatory center, which will be the focus of outpatient and specialty services. But there's also some infrastructure work that we had to do on the site and pre-development infrastructure to do on the site for example, stabilizing some properties that are close to where this hospital will be built and preserving them on the St. Elizabeth's campus. So those elements are really what drives the cost here to be the $383 million that you asked about. And so as the mayor indicated, we expect the ambulatory center will be open first and be able to see patients and starting to provide services while construction would be ongoing for the inpatient tower for the rest of the hospital facility.
Well, I appreciate that. And I don't mind saying to both you, Mr. Young, and to you, Mayor Bowser, that I know there are lots of people who are enormously ecstatic about the fact that we've got an opportunity now to move forward with something that is desperately needed on the east end of the city. I have
Councilmember Gray, your time is up.
Okay.
Around. Councilmember Trayon White, 5 minutes.
Thank you. I want to thank Mayor Muriel Bowser, City Administrator Rashad Young, CFO DeWitt for your leadership during this time, and also those who work on your staff, because I know you don't do it alone. I do want to say that the economic effects of this pandemic on FY 2020 has been significant and require a revised FY 2020 budget that addresses the revenue shortfall. Some of these changes include, as you know, $189 million in reducing in agency expenditures, also shifting $214 million spending of federal funds. I'm pleased with the structure of this budget, considering the crisis we're in and the amount of time we had to respond to it. But I think we can go a little further. I'm also calling on the federal government to do more. We must be strategic in making investments in this budget so we can spend more on as we project the income securities of our residents. I was initially concerned about DC jobs being cut and given to contractors. So I want to thank the mayor for ensuring that we are very careful about how we preserve our employees of the District of Columbia. I want to thank you for that. We live in a city every day where people of Ward 8 and Ward 7 confront the reality that we are considered less valued. The data has been crystal clear. Most telling is the death rates of COVID-19. And before even the COVID-19 came, incomes were already falling far below households in DC. DC poor families were among the poorest in major cities before COVID-19. income inequalities in DC has remained one of the highest among large cities for nearly a decade. And before COVID-19, we had an increase in rates of homelessness and housing insecurities in DC. And COVID-19 has simply exacerbated that. Our budget must proactively address the major critical investments in each sector, such as healthcare, rental assistance, employment, to meet the needs of our residents. I really wanted to touch on the equity in our city. I think that, there's a dispersion between Black and whites in DC as relates to income inequalities. Also, education is widening day by day. I was disheartened to see that we are moving the DC Infrastructure Academy from Ward 8. And I heard you, Mayor Bowles, to talk about there was an issue in retrofitting that center and all in funding. I do want to note there were $19 million that was allocated towards DC Infrastructure Academy, and which was taken out the budget that the residents, including myself of Ward 8, fought to get back in the budget, and we didn't spend all that money on retrofitting Wilkerson. So there was money there to do a new center, but we just did the one in Wilkinson. So we're going to fight to keep that in Ward 8, partly because I've been walking the community with Ernst Cisco, Hayward Donaldson in early February, March, to get residents not prepared for jobs, but prepared for careers. And so that's disheartening to find out. I also want to know what's going to happen with the Malcolm X Opportunity Center, because there was a number of organizations like Woodland Tigers was in there. They had a bartending class that was in there. Alabama Avenue CDC, Far Southeast Family Student Collaborative was there. Step Africa was there. In the Congress Heights and Congress Park community, which desperately need those services. I'm happy that we're getting Bard Center in Ward 8, but I'm concerned about what's going to happen with those already existing programs there in that facility. We also am excited about the $1.8 million to keep Excel as a site in Ward 8. I think that's a plus to the budget. The budget also maintains funding for a new hospital at St. Elizabeth East Campus, which I know Councilmember Gray is happy about. Well, we do need extensive care and wraparound services for our residents. While the aforementioned efforts are commendable, the budget as presented is not sufficient to meet the needs of people in Ward 7 and 8. And I think we can go a step further. I want to thank you all for a number of things done to ensure that we have a balanced budget. But I think we can do more during this crisis to ensure that we can save lives of those residents east of the Anacostia River. I had a few questions I asked during my statement. If you all can answer that, it would be greatly.
Yeah, thank you, Council Member. Just on the Malcolm X Opportunity Center, our intention here is to work with those organizations who are in that facility now. We know that that is a bit of a hub, if you will, for assets and anchors in the community. And so we're not starting construction immediately. Construction for the new school would occur in the spring of 2021. So we have some time to work with Woodland Tigers, with the other organization, to make sure that they can still continue those services at a different location. So we'll be engaging with them and of course with you and stakeholders as we sort of figure out where in fact they're going to be.
Oh, what about the DC Infrastructure Academy?
In terms of the Infrastructure Academy, I just amplify what the mayor's comments were about how we're looking at that facility. We did spend money to retrofit Wilkinson, but it really hasn't been the ideal location to build out the Infrastructure Academy in the manner in which we would like. For example, a critical part of the program that really prepares people for the utility-based industry is the practical experience and building having the necessary space, for example, to put the outdoor poles, to have an underground sort of simulated experience where individuals would go underground to work on infrastructure and utility equipment. Wilkinson was less than ideal for that kind of activity. And so we think that the move to Spingarn gives us more flexibility in terms of space and land for what is a critical component of that training aspect.
Councilmember White, there'll be another round, Councilmember White, but you're over your time.
All right,
we're going to start the second round, 5 minutes with the mayor, and then remember we have 2 more rounds after that. So we've only gone through 1 round. And I actually, I have some questions that I want to ask of the CFO DeWitt, which I'll do on the third round. I have no other questions for the mayor. I do want to say, echoing what other members have said, Madam Mayor, that I think the 3% increase in the UPSFF was very good. And I appreciate that the budget for UDC appears to be keeping it whole. I think that you're funding additional dollars in this tight budget when we're seeing that the local funds budget is going down slightly, that you're being able to increase as well funding for homeless services is important. So I want to thank you for all that. And with that, let me turn to Councilmember Che, second round, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Madam Mayor, I have questions about cuts in the energy division at DOEE. I want to follow up more on Foxhall, the elementary school there, and Councilmember McDuffie talked about CREAC and relief programs and such. But the one question I'm going to start with, because I think it's primarily a mayoral question and can't be fully answered by the other participants, and that is the 11th Street Bridge Park. The capital budget includes over $38.4 million in funding to the park, but those amounts simply reflect the amounts privately fundraised for the project. While the budget actually cuts the $30.3 million of district dollars that were included last year. And as you know, Mayor, although the Bridge Park project is a public-private partnership that has significant private investment, that private money is only available if we commit public money. So what I'd like to know is, what really are your plans regarding this project? Is this something, is this a way of really ending this project? I'd like to know what the long-term situation is.
Councilmember Che, this is Jenny. I'm just going to respond for a second because we're having a few technical difficulties with the mayor's computer. Can you hear me okay?
I can, but what I'm asking for is the mayor's idea about it.
Absolutely. And while we're getting it set up, I will just very briefly say thank you, Chairman Mendelson, for some of the remarks you made. We're getting the mayor back on in just a second. In regards to the 11th Street Bridge, while the mayor gets set up, we did look at projects, council member, that weren't ready to move forward. That was part of our decision making on how to prioritize the capital budget. And while we know that the private entity is making a lot of progress to be able to fundraise the money that is needed, they aren't all the way there. And so this is something I think we can come back to, certainly in a future year. But that is why we made the decision that we did today, and why we included the money to collect the private fundraising and not the sort of geo debt. But it's something we're very, I think, looking forward to putting back in once they're able to raise.
Okay, so we're not abandoning this. This is not the first step in an abandonment.
No, this is a looking at as we.
All right, because I only have so much time.
Yes, fair.
And I wanted to also ask about the Foxhall Elementary School, and I'm very happy about the $56 million in the capital budget for that new school. But I want to know if I'm correct that that money is being taken from Key and Stoddard's elementary schools additions, and do we really think that's going to fully address, and I'll use this word, overcrowding in Ward 3? I don't think so. And on top of that, you know, if you build it, they will come. We're just creating perhaps greater pressure on our middle schools and our high school for overcrowding. So I want to know, is this money from Key and Stoddard's additions?
So Councilmember Che, part of the funding is from the Key and Stoddard additions, about 40 million, and then the rest is new funding put in.
Right, so they won't get those additions now.
They're not going to get those additions, and you know, this is one of the steps we're taking to address overcrowding in Ward 3. I think the mayor, I know, would agree with you. This is not everything we need to do to address overcrowding in Ward 3. We had wanted to go much bigger when we were building the budget back in March, but the revenues are such that they are. So we've been able to make a few investments over the years. We have funding in for DEAL. expansion and then the new Foxhall. But we know that next year we're going to have to keep looking at this issue and make other strategic investments. The reason we looked at Foxhall over Key and Stoddard is that DCPS was assessing the new enrollment patterns and felt that the addition of Foxhall with 550 new seats would would be a good first investment to address the
Can I interrupt you there though? The 500 and some seats, is that to preserve 250 for the lab school?
The labs.
And then to build on the green space, and then we're going to take away that green space from whatever school children are at school there?
The lab school will remain where it is, and their field work that they're currently doing on the playground and the field around it that field space will maintain. We will be building on the parking lot and part of a DPR property over there. So the lab school will stay and their field space will stay as well.
Okay, but it'll be a separate.
Shay.
Okay, I'm over. The chairman's.
It'll be a third round.
Okay, a third round? Oh, okay.
This is the final round where the mayor has to stay. She's free to leave after this.
Okay, thank you.
There'll be 2 more 5-minute rounds for everybody. Councilmember McDuffie for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to go back to Spingarn. I think there's some real potential with what's been proposed, and I know in my letter to you, Madam Mayor, I requested some investments in Spingarn, as well as just sort of strengthening of the Infrastructure Academy. I think there, as Councilmember Silverman pointed out, there were some concerns around challenges with the Infrastructure Academy. But I think you all may be onto something with what you're proposing. I would like to hear your thoughts about the ultimate goal you want to achieve with this proposal, but also if you've given thought to some of the challenges it may present. The community of Langston Terrace, and as well as some of the other surrounding communities, both in Ward 5 and Ward 6 and 7 as well, that could really benefit from this investment. Although when you talk about introducing potentially a charter operator, I think it's going to raise some initial concerns with people, perhaps with alum and others, but also because I'll give you the example of Brown Education Campus. It's a great school that's working to get even better with a great principal, and they're doing some really amazing things there. Two Rivers, which is also a great school, is nearby, and I've heard from some who talk about just some of the challenges that it presents when you've got two schools that are continually striving to be better, so close in proximity. You've got Phelps not far from Spingarn, and historically you had Phelps right beside Spingarn. So it might be helpful for people who might be reading this to hear from you all what kinds of things you anticipate being at the Spingarn campus that would distinguish it from Phelps rather than compete with it. Phelps is a school. It's an architecture, construction, engineering school. And Spingarn would have the Infrastructure Academy if this goes through in a few years. So if you could, Madam Mayor, City Administrator, talk about what years this is in the budget for and how you all envision this working to complement the other schools that are already in the area rather than supplant or compete.
Can you hear me? Okay, I'm sorry. My microphone went out for a second. I think I'm back now. So your question was, how will an Infrastructure Academy at Spingarn complement the other schools? I think it's an incredible compliment, council member, and as you've already laid out, that area is a school's campus, and it has been. I think there are 4 schools, there are 4, and when you add Spingarn, that is just is going to be a wonderful complement because we will have some workforce training happening at Spingarn. I think we have the opportunity to look at what we need post-pandemic in terms of workforce and design programs if they're not already there to meet those needs as well. It is a large building. And that's why we think that it could be multi-tenanted with the Infrastructure Academy in another use. We think Phelps should see it as an exciting opportunity to look at its own program, attracting students to Phelps, where there may be some synergies with the Infrastructure Academy.
Thank you for that. And I look forward to following up with you all about that and really just making sure that some of the alum of Spingarn who are still really organized and others in the community are involved in thinking through this process. I do appreciate the investment though. If I could ask, I see it looks like the city administrator may have stepped away, but I wanted to ask, it looks like there's been some money added to the Department of Small Local Business Development for an emergency response system. I was curious as to what that money would be for specifically, and whether it's related directly to COVID-19 or some sort of ongoing emergency that might exist beyond the mayor's public health emergency.
Council member, I may come back to you in the next round for that. Let me just pull that and see what that specific program is.
Okay.
Let me see, Mr. McDuffie, your time is basically up. Mr. Young, Mr. Young, you're going to come back and answer that when? Rashad Young.
I'm going to come back in some subsequent round.
And I'm happy to take it offline, Mr. Chairman. I mean, it's a specific question about a position, so I'm happy to take the answer offline rather than spend the time.
Let's keep moving. Councilmember Bonds for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. And thank you again, Mayor, for the generosity in the Housing Committee proposed budget. I wanted to ask though about the resources that were in OTA for the housing database. It seems that the money has evaporated, and you and I know that having a comprehensive rental housing directory is critical to better affordable housing decisions. And I wondered, what is the likelihood that OCTO will assemble the various data points and therefore produce such a directory that could be very useful across the board?
Great. Hi, Council Member. I'm responding.
Hi, Jenny.
On behalf of the mayor. So we were able to put the capital funds keep the capital funds in the tenant advocates budget. And there is some operating dollars removed. I do think this is something that we can work with you and our OCTO partners and the Office of the Tenant Advocate to get that database to where it needs to be. We've certainly got a lot of good folks that could help.
Thank you. That was my only question. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Councilmember Bonds. Councilmember Grasso sent me a text saying that he had no further questions. I'm going to move to Councilmember Silverman, 5 minutes. Councilmember Silverman. I believe she fell off the call. Councilmember Nadeau, do you for 5 minutes?
Thank you, Chairman. Mayor, I wanted to talk about emergency rental assistance. I know with the federal funding, we may be seeing it in several different buckets now, but the proposed budget shows what I think is a cut to ERAP by 1.115 million. And I wanted to see if someone could clarify that.
Yes, I think this is one of the things, Council Member, that will appear in your errata letter. There was an error, the city administrator will correct that.
Very good. Thank you. Let's see. I also wanted to ask about adjustments to the FY20 Local Budget Act for the Department of Disability Services. Is it correct that I'm seeing a $20.7 million cut?
Right. Jenny?
Yes, council member, I'm happy to respond about that. So that is a reduction in the Department of Disability Services budget. There are two things happening there. One is we got an increased federal Medicaid assistance percentage in one of the four COVID response bills by the federal government. And that increased federal Medicaid match allowed us to recoup local dollars, mainly in healthcare finance, as well as the Department of Disability Services. We also had projected higher enrollment levels in some of our programs than we were actually seeing in the current fiscal year. And so we made some offsetting reductions there as well. But the vast majority of that is from that increased Medicaid match.
So federal dollars replacing local dollars.
That's correct. And in the 21 budget, you'll actually see an increase in DDS's budget to account for the fact that we expect more people to need services and enroll in Medicaid in FY21.
Okay, thank you. And in the CFSA budget, there appears to be a $5.3 million cut in prevention services. Which programs are facing cuts? And at what level are we funding Family First DC?
So, and we have some good news in the CFSA budget that we are able to recoup more federal dollars through our Title IV-E program that allows us to free up some of those local funds and put them onto the federal funds. The main program we are swapping over is the grandparent caregiver subsidy. So there's no reduction in service. We're just able to recoup federal dollars. And then for the Families First initiative, what you'll see is we're still able to move forward with the family success centers, but there is a small reduction that's going to be made to the grants for the different organizations. And I'm going to pull that up and let you know what that is very quickly.
I got it.
Thank you.
It's, sorry, she has to mute it. It's 1.25 million. Will reduce each grantee's grant by $75,000. Council member, and then we will make some reductions to the administrative side of that as well. So we'll cut some resources, about $75,000 for peer learning and evaluation.
Okay. Thank you. That's all I have.
Thank you, Councilmember Nadeau. Councilmember Silverman, 5 minutes.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sorry, I had technical difficulties. Madam Mayor, my understanding is that you have not touched funding for this year's Summer Youth Employment Program. Can you help us understand how SYEP will work this year, given, for example, 70% of DC government is teleworking?
Council member, we will be discussing that on Friday, and I'm not really prepared to talk about it right now. And also, I'm sure that the director, when you have your hearing, can go into further detail about it, but we'll be publicly discussing it this Friday.
Okay. Okay. Let me just talk about SYEP next year then. The Labor Committee noticed that next year's budget proposes a $1.6 million reduction in SYEP. So what are we reducing, and will it impact participation or slots?
Sure. So let me, before I turn to Jenny to talk about the specifics, just emphasize our commitment to SYEP both this year and next year. And even if this year, if it's in a modified state, we expect to serve students and have meaningful training experiences for them. We did look at that program to see if there were any fringe things that could be trimmed that didn't affect student learning or their pay. So let's, Jenny, can you talk about that?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Mayor. So there were some reductions that we made as we looked across all of our programs in government where we could find efficiencies and still maintain those core services. So there are several vacant positions that were removed from the program that the Department of Employment Services felt like they could still provide the same level of services needed. And then there's also a reduction in the extended year programming. So we're often able to provide extensions for the 18 to 24-year-olds at the end of the summer. And we unfortunately made the hard decision to remove those as we wanted to maintain the core infrastructure of the program. I think that is something that certainly if our revenues start to improve, we would look at trying to restore and would have time to do that in the fiscal year and put it in the supplemental budget next year.
Thank you, Ms. Reed. It's hard sometimes to toggle between this year's budget and next year. So you said that next year you've eliminated the extension for 18 to 24-year-olds. Is it remaining intact this year?
It is remaining intact this year. We made no changes to the SYEP budget for the current fiscal year.
Okay, thank you very much. Moving on. Madam Mayor, I am glad to see the significant investment in the capital budget for new early childhood education centers. I think there was a little bit of discussion about this earlier. Certainly this is going to add significant capacity for infants, toddlers, and young children in our very high demand early childhood programs. These investments, though, are mostly in fiscal year 22. And I'm sure I certainly don't need to tell you as a mom how important our early childcare system is to our workforce. I think you mentioned it earlier. You know, if you don't have someone to look after your kid, it doesn't matter if you're the mayor or a minimum wage worker, you can't work. So given how important this is to our economy and to family sanity, frankly, why not include financial operating support this year and next year for private daycare centers to ensure that we can reopen as soon as possible? Is there any way we can find federal funding for this?
Yes, and I just want to understand what your request is in turn. What are you asking that we invest?
Yes, you know, we've heard from many of our early childhood childcare center providers that they just can't financially reopen. And it seems so critical to our reopening and frankly, to everyone's sanity. I'm not a parent myself, but I know many parents who are, you know, want to make sure that their childcare centers can remain open. So, you know, what about like some kind of local paycheck protection program where we forgive if it's for salaries, for example, but this seems critical to our reopening. And frankly, just to the operations of our city and to our families. Seems like it would be a good investment.
No, absolutely. And so Jenny did discuss, I think to respond to Councilmember Todd's question, who brought it up initially about child care investment. So we talked about the things that we've set up during our pandemic response, including child care for emergency essential workers, as well as the continued payment of the DC subsidy to child care centers that are closed. So that makes up a tremendous, that are right now closed, that are still getting the same payment from the city that they would have otherwise gotten. And then there is additional federal funding that's coming through OSSI, I believe, that can support some efforts that we will invest. And I think that we are also contemplating how we work in the needs of child care centers in our reopening investments that are in consideration. Jenny, anything to add to that?
Mayor, I would just also add that I believe that our child care centers are also eligible for some of the federal programs, the Federal Paycheck Protection Program and Emergency Disaster Loan Programs, and OSSI has been able and willing to help them navigate the system to be able to apply for those. So for any of our child care facility operators watching, please do reach out and we're happy to try to connect you to the federal resources that are available.
Thank you, Councilmember Silverman. Councilmember Allen.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Ms. Mayor, I've heard a few people already mention this, but I want to make sure I added mine as well. And that's a thank you for the investment that you're making with our schools. I know, obviously, pre-pandemic, we were looking at an even greater increase in our student funding formula, but doing the 3% I think is still good. And if there's ways we can work on how to keep moving that up, we certainly will. But I think I heard you answer a question the other day about when someone asked about it being a goodie, and you said it's a must-have, and I completely agree. And I'm really glad that you were able to prioritize that in an overall very tough budget. I know that wasn't easy to do. I also thought that the number of investments, as we look at the capital improvements within our schools, certainly continues. And I think that's an important part, as we all recognize, of overall continuing to improve our schools. I think in particular, being able to add in Tyler and Seton both into the long-term capital plan is a very good thing. Making sure we've got the right funds necessary for J.O. Wilson and Elliott Hine, as well as the addition for Brent Elementary. And I know to the Brent Elementary school community, this doesn't include a full modernization and expansion yet that I do think they need. And so I look forward to working with you, as mayor, and your team on thinking through that strategy overall. And then in Amadon Bowen Elementary in Southwest, where I think you talked about this yesterday, including both 0 to 3 space as well as additional pre-K space. This is a neighborhood that is certainly growing quickly with families. Certainly the Amadon Bowen is filling up, and we also have just done a great job with your team partnering at Jefferson Middle School, where there's just going to be there's already an outstanding middle school, but now they're going to have the facility that finally matches it, which is just going to be fantastic, and I think draw even more people into our system, which is wonderful. So I'm very glad to see that and look forward to seeing how we continue to get those investments in place. And I also was glad to see that the early childhood program at the old Minor site, which is an old shuttered building right next to the new Minor elementary school, but it's just basically preserving those funds to get that into the early childhood, I think is going to be really important. One of the questions I was going to ask you had to do with, as we think through our education funding, we know that we obviously are going to have a lot of work ahead of us. And I know announcements will be coming in the not too distant future around what next school year might look like. But we all know there's going to be a significant education recovery effort that's going to be needed to help get at the gap that is only widening right now, as we certainly have different experiences for different households in terms of what their distance learning can look like. Can you talk a little bit about, are we anticipating being able to use federal dollars to come in to help support some of that additional support that's going to be necessary? I know certainly I can see it with my own kids, the social emotional distance right now from the isolation does take its toll. Can you talk a little about some of the investments that you want to be making in that space? And are we also looking to bring in federal dollars to help in that regard?
Yes, council member. Let me just say that when we talk about the federal dollars, we have, I don't want to confuse anybody, because we have some state level federal funding that are enhancements that are coming just like every state gets. And that includes education funding, some through OSSI, and I think some directly to DCPS and the LEAs. So that part is coming, and consider that separate and apart from the CARES Act funding, the $495 that we have and the $775 that we're still seeking. So when you talk about is there federal funding, there are some federal funds that we will apply in the area of schools. That's the state level funding. And then I think that we also have to consider contemplating what is really what about our school year or our facilities or practices have to be modified to accommodate bringing kids back to in-person learning. And we would consider that as part of the COVID response. But let me ask Jenny to speak to the city administrator to speak to what the state level funding for schools is.
Okay, and if I could, because I did have one extra question I wanted to ask in this round, so if you can save me just a teeny bit of time.
Just real quick, there's $54 million we're expecting to come to DCPS and charters through federal funding that will help us support the reopening of schools and making sure they have what they need to move forward.
Okay, great. I look forward to getting more information as well as we go through the education committees. Last question I wanted to ask on this round just had to do with from transportation. As I looked through, it looked like as we think about our bus priority efforts, which I think is certainly an important part also of helping WMATA with its recovery. I noticed that it seems that within the DDOT budget, you've got bus priority efforts that are now in their own master project funding. Should we be interpreting that as you're kind of further prioritizing some of that bus priority expenditures? Does that in any way help advance some of the bus priority investments that you're looking to make by kind of changing the way it's categorized and defined within the budget? And if so, I'm encouraging that.
Yes, council member, I'm happy to answer that question. So yes, the creation of the new master project is our first step in making the bus corridor improvements and efficiency of our buses a higher priority. So what we've done there is move funding that you've previously seen for 16th Street and finishing up that project, as well as some of our circulator bus improvements. And we plan to use that project in the coming years to add more funding for major corridor efficiency improvements across the city. So we look forward to expanding that master project in the coming years.
Okay, thanks. I know that can be a little bit wonky sometimes about how the budget's organized, but I think that's a very encouraging sign, and I definitely support the way you've got this lined up to be adding in more resources and more prioritization for our bus priorities. So thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Councilmember Allen. Councilmember Todd, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. And I have 2 quick questions, and thank you, Mayor and team, for bearing with us. In the budget, there's $2 million to support and enhance the district's cybersecurity preparedness and incident response capabilities. And I will be discussing with CFO Parker the needs there. Do we think that those needs will increase the longer that DC government employees are working remotely from a number of different connections?
Well, thank you for that question, Council Member. And I know that your focus is on government operations, and it's not always the most exciting part of the budget to talk about government operations, but it is critical to us being able to do the things that we need to do for DC residents. And certainly we have about 40% of our people teleworking now. I have to say they're teleworking more smoothly today than they were when we started. And we are able to continue to offer very critical services to DC residents. You raise a good question because we are concerned about our systems and protecting our systems. So we think that this is a good investment in being able to maintain our cybersecurity. We were concerned about cyber before the pandemic, to be honest with you, and making sure we've seen some attacks on peer cities across the nation, and our CFO, our Office of Risk Management, we have all been very focused on making sure we harden our systems. We work with our independent agencies as well, council included, to make sure that all of the potential impacts to DC government systems are maintained. So we will look to build on that investment in future budgets. Do you want to add anything, Jeff?
No, Mayor, other than it's obviously a security issue that we talk about in New York. It's a concern of what happened in Atlanta and Baltimore. And I think it's something we have to invest in, and I appreciate that you putting that as a priority in your budget.
Thank you very much, and certainly appreciate those investments because I think, as you noted, they're very, very important. And I was very excited to see in the budget $6.5 million to support continued improvement of circulator bus system. And I am a big proponent of the circulator. I'm a huge proponent of its expansion across the district, particularly in areas of Ward 4 where we need greater public transit options. Does this 6.5 million, does it include any expansions, or is this just to keep the circulator in appropriate running order?
You're referring to the 6.2 million increase for related to circulator?
Yes.
It is, council member, it is just to keep it in working order. It's not part of a planned expansion, unfortunately, but this is just increased contractual and operational costs that we had to put in the 21 budget.
Got it. Thank you, Mr. City Administrator. And I don't have any further questions. Thank you.
Oh, council member, if I could, just one other piece with respect to the circulator. We've been working for a couple of years now, I think, at least a year and a half, on where we would place the maintenance facility for the circulator. and that is funded separately in the capital budget. But I just wanted to point out that we have a significant investment to put the circulator fleet maintenance facility in and have a home for our circulator system to be maintained. And so we'll be moving forward on that project even this year.
Okay, thank you very much. And then, Mr. City Administrator, while I have you, in the budget, there's $6 million allocated to extend IT devices for our elementary and middle schools. Do we think that is enough as we consider the possibility of distance learning happening in the fall?
So it is a good start. We are going to look at how we've deployed those nearly 9,000 devices for students who are at home now and redeploy those to those in greatest needs, and depending on how we evolve with the opening of the school year. But we also will have federal resources we hope that we can leverage for additional IT devices that would support our investment locally of $6 million.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Councilmember Todd. Councilmember Robert White for questions.
Yeah, thank you again, Madam Mayor and City Administrator Young. So I went back and looked because I had, on the crime reduction issue, I had requested some stats from the Office of Neighborhood Safety and Engagement just several days ago. And what I got shows violent crime decreased overall by 7% in the Ward 1 priority community areas. It decreased by 48% in the Ward 4 priority community areas, by 17% in the Ward 6 priority community areas, and violent crime had decreased by 10% in the Ward 8 priority areas for ones. So the data that I have from the ones office shows that it is indeed working. So I guess I'm even more lost on why we would start to divest from the program so soon.
So again, I just point you back to my previous comment, Councilman White. Two factors that we're talking about here. The first is where we think we have the greatest impact in terms of our investment, not to suggest there is no impact from violence interruption, because we're still maintaining violence interruption, right? And so if we didn't think it was at all impactful or helpful, then we probably make a different decision about the use of violence interruption in communities, and we're not making that decision. The point that we're trying to make is that where we think the data shows the best evidence, for example, is in the Pathways program, so we maintain that investment as a whole. There are lots of different factors that influence violence reduction, and we think certainly violence interrupters are a part of that. But the data doesn't show the strongest linkage between their efforts in that reduction, because we do a whole host of other things to help reduce violence in communities and supports in communities that we think impact that number. The second thing, which is very consequential to this conversation, again, is that we invested one-time resources in fiscal year 20, which are very difficult to maintain in a recurring basis in fiscal year 21. So I think you have to consider both of those issues when you talk about what happened in the one's office budget.
I appreciate that. I should note, though, that the MPD budget has an increase of $18.5 million. So, we are deciding where we're going to spend our prevention dollars.
Let me speak to that, because the greatest cause of the increase in MPD's budget is for us to pay the contractually negotiated costs for those officers in fiscal year 20 that then carry to fiscal year 21. That is the greatest factor in the increase in MPD's budget.
Thank you. The DGS, Department of General Services capital budget includes $10 million for phase 1 of the Daily Building renovation project in fiscal year 21. I don't see additional funding in later years. So how much do you expect this project to cost in total, and how many phases?
Sorry, I needed to unmute. So we do think it's going to be a multi-phase project. This is to address the most critical infrastructure issues in the Daily Building. We've had challenges in that building for years, and so we want to get started on some of those critical system repairs. Our latest estimate in sort of thinking about a complete overhaul of the Daily Building is upwards to $200 to $300 million. We've been looking at a public-private partnership process to best finance that, or even just our traditional renovation approach to how we address buildings. But this will be a long-term and expensive commitment, but we want to get the most critical systems beginning to be addressed and planning for future phases.
Thank you. The public-private partnership request for proposals was put out and I think closed. I think it was 2018. Do we have partners yet, and are we still anticipating using a public-private partnership model for that building?
For the Daly building in particular?
Yes.
So we're still evaluating the best approach. Part of the consideration, if you will, for how we approach a project like Daly of that significant size is really how that financing is treated under the district's debt rules. And we've been working with the CFO's office and the Office of Attorney General to better understand and think about how we would structure a partnership in a way that didn't adversely impact the debt cap. Because if we pursue a P3 and it is counted in the debt cap just like any general obligation project would, then it argues for us just issuing the debt ourselves and moving the project through a more traditional vehicle. And so as we continue to look at how the P3 project for these very expensive projects impact us on the debt side, that will in part be the determination about if we proceed with a P3 for a project like the Daly building.
Thank you. My fear is that we might be spending $1 million and not be able to do the public-private partnership, but we will save that conversation for future hearings since I'm out of time.
Only if I could just add, if we didn't do a P3, then we would come back with a traditional design build project, and we would then put that into the capital plan, much like we approach other building projects.
Councilmember Gray, 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. Madam Mayor, I want to join with Chairman Mendelson and with the Education Committee Chair Grasso in congratulating you. I'm almost amazed that you could find 3% to increase the education budget by. And then I guess one could easily raise the question of how can we not, given the success we've had with education in the city. Last year, we had a number of challenges. Some schools that lost students wound up losing more than 5% of their funding last year. And we cobbled together, along with our colleagues, some ways in which to be able to make sure that we kept the funding moved it up a tad anyway. Do we, are there any schools this year that are in this budget that are losing more than 5% of their funding from what will be the current year to next year?
I don't think you'll find any schools here that are losing more than 5%. And we have worked with our stabilization fund to ensure that schools, and I think they already went through this process when they got the initial schools budget, that they could appeal any element of that to the chancellor, and the stabilization funds were added at that point. So I think we don't have the issue that many of you were concerned about last year.
Okay. Well, if I can be a bit parochial, do you know whether there are any Ward 7 schools that are losing 5% or more?
There should be none that are losing more, and we will be happy to go with you any impacts we see on the Ward 7 schools individually.
Okay, I'd love to have that continuing conversation with you and your team about what we can expect this coming year as a result of this budget. Again, I'm amazed that we actually can have a 3% increase. Is there a spreadsheet somewhere that we can look at that says, here's what the schools, 3% obviously is an overall increase, but do you have a spreadsheet that shows what the increases or changes are in the schools that we can look at, Mayor?
Yeah.
Is your question changes in individual schools or changes?
That's right.
Yes, we can provide that information to you. And what I will tell you, Councilmember, also is that school-based budgets actually did not change from the mayor's initial announcement of 4% to this revised recommendation of 3%. So the school-based budgets that were allocated based upon the 4% model have remained in this budget. And we found efficiencies and reductions in other places that did not impact schools at the school level, at the individual school level.
Okay, well, I know we'll be asked that question repeatedly, so I would appreciate getting that kind of spreadsheet from you so we can see what the changes are. And I wouldn't mind seeing the entire city, but I certainly want to see Ward 7 since those folks will be knocking on our door. Let me ask you another question related to the shameful shafting that we got from the federal government. We should have gotten $750 million more for the CARES funding. And there should be a lot of shame. There doesn't seem to be any at some levels for us getting nailed the way we did. If we were to get the $750 million that we thought we should have gotten, we know we should have gotten, not thought, but we know we should have gotten, what is it that the money would be used for at this stage? And if we don't get it, what's the plan B at that stage for being able to cover those costs that are associated with, with those things that would have been paid for?
Well, thank you, Council Member. As you know, Congresswoman Norton and Speaker Pelosi have included this funding in the HEROES bill that the House Democrats advanced. It still has to go through the Senate. I'm sure you are aware of the things going back and forth with that. We continue to advocate on all sides, House, Senate, White House, on making sure that the district is made whole, and will continue to do that. In our presentation to you yesterday on slide 34, we described the buckets of funds that those monies could be used for. And we think this makes the difference between an orderly and a robust phased reopening plan, and and another one where the businesses are kind of left on their own. We obviously would prefer an orderly, supported reopening plan. We think it's best for our economy, but more than that, we think that it's best for us to deal with the fall, be it that the infections reoccur, or we have a rough flu season, or anything that comes with the fall. I'll just mention a couple of the buckets: PPE, physical build outs, people and equipment to help screen symptoms. That could be for the government or private sector. Public spaces, any modifications we want to make to public spaces, including streets, parks, and the like. Continued testing, tracing, and treatment, and also preparation for a new vaccine. Continued support of children and vulnerable populations who will be able to re-enter or reopen more slowly. Plans for distance learning, should we incorporate that into our school year upcoming. And for, I think someone else mentioned how we can support residents with utilities and other bills that will be coming due after the public health emergency. Are also contemplating in our our late phase businesses that have to reopen, who are going to be closed, that were closed first and will be closed the longest. So those are some of the buckets of support that we think will help with a speedier, more orderly phased reopening.
Okay, thank you, Mayor. My time up, Mr. Chairman?
Yeah, you're 2 minutes and 30 seconds over. So you'll have a third round. Councilmember Trayon White, 5 minutes.
Thank you. I do want to piggyback on the conversation as relates to the Infrastructure Academy. As you know, City Administrator, we sat down and pressed the issue about it staying in Ward 8 and also compromising about getting it in Wilkerson. And so we are not satisfied with the new decision as relates to that, because we need access to careers and training opportunities that lead to careers in our community, especially in the Anacostia area. I do want to note also the sentiments of my colleagues as it relates to the violence across the district. Since I've been on this call, we've had 2 men and a lady shot in the Anacostia area, which continue to be an area of concern in Ward 8, including other areas. And so I'm not happy about the $863,000 cut in the one's office, the Office of Neighborhood Safety and Engagement. And I think we should be putting more money into the budget as relates to public safety, not a divestment in violence prevention strategies around mental health, substance abuse, and wraparound services with our violence interrupters. I also want to ask, Madam Mayor, where are we with Reunion Square and the 3 senior homes in Ward 8?
3, what was the last part of the 3 senior homes?
Yes, ma'am. And I'm sorry, 2 senior homes and 1 senior wellness facility.
Oh, okay, I got it. Reunion Square, CA, remind me of what we got back. It's in. So Reunion Square is in after a long time getting something that everybody could support. We are able to support the TIF, the first ever TIF in Ward 8. The CFO scored it with a number of the changes that were made, and we're pleased to fund it here. And on the Senior Wellness Center, let me ask the CA to talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. Councilmember White. So for the Ward 8 Senior Wellness Center, which is in the capital budget at $8.9 million for fiscal year 21, we have been working to solidify a location there, and we really want to move forward and start to engage the community around that location. We were focused on Kramer Middle School as being the location for the Ward 8 Senior Wellness Center. We also think that that could be a great co-located area for the Anacostia Rec Center, so that we would both have the Senior Wellness Center and the Anacostia Rec Center on the site of Kramer.
Let me just go, Councilmember, you hear me?
Is that the mayor speaking?
Yeah.
Councilmember, and let me just go back to your first statement about how we're investing in violence interruption. We've discussed it a number of times, and we are very much invested in making sure that the Pathways program is up and running, and making sure that we're adding to the leadership councils at the schools, which I know you have been very supportive of and has worked well in Anacostia. And the CA has talked about the one-time funding. There's a lot of energy from the council in replacing that one-time funding. I don't know that we would object to that, but I think that you also need to look very closely at the synergies between that outreach work and actually having services connected to that outreach work. Outreach work with no services doesn't help. And that's why we have been very focused on Pathways, where we have small cohorts working with the professionals in our one's office. So I don't want there to be any mistake about our commitment to making sure that people are matched up to the programs and services that they need, that have been helpful, and also our expansion of a model building on credible messengers that work in our one's office, and that supported by DYRS is working for our young people.
Thank you. Also, Madam Mayor, we've experienced a lot of back and forth last year as relates to schools in Ward 8. Like my council colleague, Vincent Gray, I would like to get a breakdown of the budgets for our Ward 8 schools. If you can get that to us, that'd be greatly appreciated.
Well, I appreciate that. And I also want to emphasize on something that we haven't focused on enough, I think, council member, for Ward 8, and that's what the addition of the Bard Early College in Ward 8 will do at the Malcolm X Opportunity Center. The CAA has already talked about how we're going to work on a transition for the nonprofits who are working there. Malcolm X Opportunity Center was always meant to be temporarily used in that way so that building could be fully used and fully utilized. So bringing a program that's showing great success that allows our young people to earn college credits for free and transfer those credits on to college when they go, and it's going to be connected by the Congress Heights Metro Station into the housing and retail at St. Elizabeth's is a huge win for the city and for Ward 8. You have also been very concerned, and as we have, about making sure we come up with some permanency for the Excel Academy, which is also an outstanding program for girls. And that's right adjacent to Berry Farm at the tip, in Anacostia, at a wonderful location. And being able to secure a permanent home for them is also going to be hugely important for Ward 8. So we are happy to share with you the additional spreadsheet of all the investments in the schools. But as it goes with increased school spending, these are huge.
I'll ask my additional questions in the next round, Chairman.
Yes, and there are 2 more rounds. So Mayor Bowser, we've always asked you to be present for 1 10-minute round. Instead, we had 2 5-minute rounds. But if you wish to excuse yourself to handle other business, you are welcome to do that, or you can stick around. I'm going to begin the 3rd round, and I have some questions for the Chief Financial Officer.
Well, thank you. I know that he is anxious to answer your questions, and I'm anxious to get on to some other business. But I didn't know how this was going to work. It worked very well, and I want to thank the council for doing the people's business in this modified way. And Mary, I know I owe you an answer to a question where my microphone didn't work, and I'll get that to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. So Mr. DeWitt, I have 3 questions. We'll see how many I can cover in this round. The first is, I want to challenge you on your revenue estimates. How prudent are your revenue estimates if we have a second wave of the virus?
I would say the model assumes we won't have a second wave. We're assuming we open prudently, which I know you sat with me on the Reopen DC committee, and I think it's important that we open in a safe way that we can continue to move forward and not have to close everything back down. If there is what I would call a W, where you go down, you go up, and then a fall again because we have to reclose everything again, and our modeling of that would be about $300 million worse in 2021. So that forecast does not assume that we don't open prudently, that we open, get going, and have to close again. That would actually be a downside risk of the forecast, which we mentioned when we laid out the forecast. What are the risks of being worse? One of those was a reclosing after opening in the late summer, in the mid to late summer.
Isn't it likely, though, given how the president has been pushing to reopen, and some of the states are moving to reopen even while the numbers associated with the virus continue to escalate? Doesn't that increase our risk that we will have a second wave?
It does, and I think that's the point of why we need to be prudent on not going crazy with any other changes that are substantial. We need to make sure we have the ability to respond to that. I think, at least my opinion from sitting on the Reopen DC steering committee and hearing how we're proceeding with that, we are going to be recommending a very prudent opening. But as you know, you get a flood of tourists coming here. If those are open that are not acting prudently, we could have a second. It doesn't mean there won't be a second wave of infections. It's whether you're open in a way where you don't have to fall back. You can continue to gradually go forward. So I would say the plans are at least trying to do that.
I didn't understand. Very last point you said, I forget how you phrased it, but I didn't understand it.
I'm not sure what you're referring to there.
Yeah, it was about 2 sentences back. Well, let me try this. The revenue estimates on which this budget is based were issued on April 24th, I believe. And that means based on work through roughly a week earlier. You're going to do revenue estimates again on, I don't know if it's formal, at the end of August.
Correct.
The-
Yes.
With other states opening what looks to me like earlier than they should, because they're seem to be opening based on political pressure from the White House or from citizenry, opening sooner than they should, we're going to see that the pandemic continues to be high or is increasing in other states that are opening. We may be following prudent practices, but I'm reminded of how this pandemic began, which was just a few travelers from, I guess, China to the United States or China to other countries and then to the United States. So if we have travelers, just a few from some of these states, doesn't it look like it could be likely that we will see a second wave?
You know, that is a probability. I think if you're asking me, would I change the forecast based on what I know differently than what we knew on April 24th? We've clearly had those discussions. So one of the positives is the stock market, for whatever reasons I don't completely understand candidly, is not doing as bad as we thought it would be. It's actually kind of back to where it was, which is a positive for 2021 in terms of income taxes. On the opening, we are fairly conservative in our opening that it's not going to go all the way back by the end of the year. So we're assuming a late summer opening and a gradual recovery, which may help offset a second wave. But if we get opening and we get all the way to say to phase 2 of our opening, and we have to shut all the way back down to the same place we are, the forecast does not contemplate that, which is why we want to be prudent in maintaining our ability to be resilient in the event that that happens. And I don't think we're going to know that in August either. That's going to be one of the challenges. Is whether that will be known in August. But we will be able to reflect in the August forecast the actual reopening plans that the district has, and we'll be able to see where the virus is in terms of some of these states, as you said, that may not be open prudently and whether we need to rethink that. And so every week we get more information.
Let me phrase it this way. I don't have the chart in front of me, but the steering committee for Reopen DC has been looking at 4 stages following the current situation. And the 4th stage is back to normal or a new normal, where there aren't limitations. But even the 3rd stage, as I recall, it's sporadic incidents of the virus, sporadic, as opposed to localized. And the recommendation seems to be that there can't be gatherings greater than 250, which means no conventions, no sporting events. And that's a lot of business.
And we assume there would be none of that until until the spring of 21 in our forecast. So the forecast is generally following the recommendations of the committee so far. And again, there's some positives on one area, but I don't disagree with you. And I think that gets to the point. The forecast can get worse, but it's our best guess at the current time.
But you don't see the forecast out of sync with where Reopen DC is, which is that we may not get to stage 4 until the vaccine.
Yeah, so we're assuming it's going to be mid-21 before, that we would start seeing the economy get back. And even then, you look at the forecast, we don't get it all the way back. It gets maybe to 90% because there's damage done along the way. So the forecast reflects that Nike swoosh curve, as I call it, where you're down and you go back up. And we don't have it really back to normal, whatever that is, until 2022. So 2021 has a recovery through it all the way through. We're projecting unemployment will still be at 10% in July of 2021 in our forecasting model. We don't get back to remotely to where we were before this started. We're at 15% probably now. We'll probably hit 18% in July. So I would say it's still our best estimate, but it can get worse. And to all your points, and we'll have a better feel for where that is in August.
I'm out of time. Councilmember Che, correct, 5 minutes?
Yes, thank you. I have one remaining question for now with respect to the Foxhole School, and that is, since some of the money is being taken from the additions at Key and Stoddard, I wanted to ask whether the trailers at Key and Stoddard will remain.
Councilmember, we'll have to follow up with that with DCPS to be able to let you know the status of those trailers.
Okay, and then the other thing is I wanted to talk about DOEE and the energy division reduction there. There's a very significant reduction in funding there, over 22 million, and the spending reductions are focused on the agency's budget covering performance, data tracking, development of policies and programs to support renewable energy technology, administration of the SEU contract, among other things. And the budget chapter suggests that 22 million of that 28 million in that division is to fund the Green Bank. So that's one thing. And I thought we were anticipating new revenues for the Green Bank instead of taking it from other programs. But even still, it leaves 6 million in reductions. And I wanted to know what services have been cut or reduced to get that additional 6 million.
Director Reed.
Thank you for that question. Thank you for that question, Council Member. I did want to flag that the Green Bank funding has been moved into a separate enterprise fund, and I think that's why you don't see it shown up in the DOEE budget anymore. I believe the other reduction that you're looking at refers to the CREAC program, where we did reduce some local funding, but we're very confident that the program will still be able to meet all of the needs for residents and nonprofits and other businesses because the funding is non-lapsing in this fiscal year, and they still have a fairly large unspent balance. And we'll get back to you. I'll just confirm that there's no other reductions in that line item, and we'll follow up with you and your team.
Well, thank you. And with respect to CREAC, my understanding about that, and I know Councilmember McDuffie had a question about that initially, is that one of the reasons why there may be some balances there is that it was slow to get underway, and that once it gets, really underway, that we may have, and I don't know if you're anticipating, if there's going to be an effect on the ability of people to participate and what the plan B is there.
So, Councilmember, even with the slower rollout in 2019, we see enrollments are slightly up in 2020, and we're anticipating greater utilization of CREAC in 2020. Even with that, we expect there to be substantial resources in 2021 to meet the demand. We're expecting that in 2021, we will have still over $7 million available to support CREAC from both the nonprofit and residential community. And that's with increased utilization in 2020. Okay,
I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about the Benning Road transfer station. The budget, the capital budget includes almost 30 million to demolish and rebuild the Benning Road transfer station. And it says that the transfer station is in, quote, dire need of being torn down because it's a safety hazard in its current state. But the majority of the funding doesn't come for the project until 2026, with only several million in earlier years for short-term improvements. So I was wondering if there is a safety hazard situation there, why we're waiting so long to begin construction on that transfer station.
So there are some resources now to help stabilize the transfer station until we actually can get to what is in the CIP for its rebuild.
Okay, so you're satisfied that we can keep it together until
with a little bit of bubble gum and tape, but
okay.
we feel pretty good that we can keep it where it needs to be.
All right, and then do you know whether the new building will be just another transfer station, or is it intended that it will have additional aspects to it, like anaerobic digesters, donation exchange drop-off, some of the other more progressive things that we were hoping for?
We do in fact hope to rebuild it so that it is not just a traditional transfer station, and looking to modernize it so that it can include some of those capabilities that you're talking about. So we have some time to continue that planning process, but certainly we want that transfer station to be best in class and employ all the best practices for solid waste disposal.
Okay, it's amazing how quickly 5 minutes goes. I realized you don't have to tell me, Mr. Chairman, I'm done.
One more round after this. Councilmember McDuffie.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, CFO and City Administrator for sticking with us. I wanted to ask the CFO, are there any particular unknowns out there that still may keep you up at night? I know there's some thought and some talk, which, you know, is just that at this point, but the president talking about perhaps moving the income tax filing date back. Is that settled yet? In terms of whether that's going to stay at July 1? If that gets pushed back, how will it impact our finances?
Thank you, council member. That has not been set. That's a discussion, and I can tell you at the bi-weekly meetings of the National Association of State Treasurers, it's a concern of every jurisdiction because we are relying on some of that income tax to come in to help match our cash flows up for the end of the year. Although it would be helpful, obviously, to residents to defer that. It is revenue that we're looking for. So that would be one of the items that concerns me about what that would do to our ending year cash reserve balance, although we would get it next year and it would help. But that is one area. And it's not settled yet.
If they do push it, what are we going to need to do in order to address any issues with our ending year cash?
We would just sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just saying, would it come from reserves or would it come from debt? How would we address it?
We would have to see where our cash flow ends up with everything else, but that'd probably put us 140 million roughly short of where we think we were going to get, because a lot of people have already paid. It would be deferments of some individuals, but that would put us short of where we expected to be. We do have that tax revenue anticipation notes that we could use if we needed to get through August. So we have put all the tools in place to handle it if it happens, but that does not that's not a positive for our ending September 30th unless it's paid before then.
If we use the trans, how would that impact? Would we have to take care of that 2 years later, or how would that factor into the 4-year budget plan?
The tax revenue anticipation notes would cover the August where we hit our low point, and then they would have to be repaid back in September, but we may not be full. In other words, our reserves may not be full at the end of September like we had planned in the budget. And so that could put us in a situation where we have to borrow our short-term borrowing, which is the other tool we have, which are called GO notes. Those would have to be paid back, and those would have to go in the budget. So that would be a negative impact on the budget. So we're looking at our cash flows every week, and hopefully we'll find a way to get where that gets full. If it's not full, we might be able to deal with it, but it puts us in a less good position for getting through 2021. If it's really, really significant, let's say $300 million short, then we would have to do that borrowing, and then that would be an impact on the budget we'd have to pay back. So we're trying to do everything. We worked with the city administrator and had many late night discussions about how to manage the 2020 cash flow in order to end the year with it full so that we don't have to borrow, because if we borrow and it goes across the fiscal year, you then have to budget it because you have to pay it back. We do not want to use that $300 million of GO notes except in an emergency, because it takes a budget impact when you have to repay it.
Got it. I want to probably just take the last minute or so that I have to mention to the city administrator. I appreciate the sort of back and forth that we've had thus far around the Office of Neighborhood Safety, Violence Prevention. I know, I let off my comments and questions earlier with concerns around that. And I know some of my colleagues have also raised concerns. And I do appreciate the response that you provided in terms of the one-time money that was placed in the FY20 budget. But I also appreciate what the mayor said recently, that we have to be mindful of the need to maintain those robust services to provide to individuals who are able to engage. And I think that while it is a challenge that we're currently seeing in the community where certain violence interruption organizations can engage and connect with young men and women, but don't have the supports if they're coming from the Attorney General's office, with what the Office of Neighborhood Safety is doing, where they do have the supports, but I think there's an argument that they don't do the violence interruption work at the same level, and it's a different model. So my time has expired, but I'm just gonna encourage you again to maybe have that conversation with the Office of the Attorney General, and that you all are talking about efficiencies that be created if there's a consolidation. They do direct violence interruption in the neighborhoods. You all do supports through pathways and other things very well. I think coming together would do the city well if you're able to figure out a way to do that.
Councilmember McDuffie. Thank you. Councilmember Bonds, 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chairman. I have a couple of questions for the CFO, if he's still with us. I know that taxes are always a no-no, but I want to know if we were to rescind the personal tax relief that we gave to the 350,000 income earners, would that cover the, you just mentioned it would be like $300 million if additional, or you said another, add to the worst case scenario, if we had a second wave of the virus. And if we were, is there a way to include that resource in our current budget plan with the option to reverse it if the second wave does not actually affect us? Just wondered.
Councilmember Bonds, are you referring to the Tax Act of a couple years ago, the tax reform?
Yes, yes, definitely.
That's something you'd have to look at. You're saying whether some of the benefits that people got from our tax code from the Federal Tax Act, whether we could get any revenue out of that? Is that your question?
Yes, I'm really asking if we were to reverse what we did, would we benefit to the tune of the 300 million? Would that solve the problem, or is it less amount that we would benefit?
I would have to go back and look at that and get back to you about what the exact dollar numbers of that was, but I don't remember it being. It wouldn't raise that much money. I'm getting some feedback from my folks at ORA. It wouldn't raise that much money.
Okay, I was just curious. Okay, and so those are my two for you, sir. Thank you very much. For the city administrator, I want to know, in the budget, you have, I think it's 34 new positions in the Office of Attorney General. Can you tell me what they are for?
As the Attorney General is a separate elected agency and an independent agency, although in the executive, I would leave that to the AG to describe what his positions are. We worked with him to try to establish a budget and a number and ensure also that we could capture any savings that we could to help resolve the deficit. But I think it's best that he speaks to what those positions are for.
Well, I asked because it's one of the few places in the budget where we see an increase of personnel. Yes, we see the increase with the public schools, but I was just very curious. As our committee, the Housing Committee, from time to time has provided some resources for various positions. So I was just very curious what this might be, whether it's consumer or just what. But okay, I guess I'll have to ask. I thought the city administrator is the city administrator. And so I'm coming to you. I may have to come back. The other thing is, what I believe that the project and sponsor-based vouchers have the elimination of project and sponsor-based vouchers from the Housing Authority budget plan. Now, I want to know, does this indicate that this type of subsidy will not be requested in the traditional NOFA conducted by DHCD?
So really what we're doing here, Councilmember Bonds, is if you recall, when we typically budget for those vouchers, there's a lag time between the point at which we budget and the point at which that project comes online and those vouchers are used. And so what we have done in this budget is to really align when the budget would reflect the use of those vouchers with that expenditure. So later in the financial plan, when we expect those units to come online, that's where those voucher dollars show up.
Okay, so in other words, no more having to set them aside because the project has been approved in advance.
That's correct. We were working
I
with
just
the
want to
CFO
understand your
do that,
concept.
and I'm thanking the CFO for working with us in partnership to be able to do that.
Okay, so we moved to real life. Okay.
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I have another question, but my time is up, and I'll be respectful best I can see the clock. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councilmember Bonds. Councilmember Silverman, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. City Administrator, I want to turn to affordable housing. So it appears that the budget for our main housing agency, the Department of Housing and Community Development, has taken a pretty severe decline. It looks like it's gone from 212 million in FY 2019 to, it looks like an 82 million proposed in this budget. So can you explain why we've cut so much from this agency?
Director Reed will be happy to explain those numbers to you.
So I think what's happening here, council member, is that when you look at the FY19 numbers, in 2019, we were capturing some of the Housing Production Trust Fund money, the actual subsidy money in DHCD's budget, and that's no longer happening. It's staying in its separate chapters elsewhere in the plan. So that sort of covers the big change from 2019. The other changes that you'll see going into 2021 have to do with the preservation fund, which is, unfortunately declining, although we're still able to make an investment in it in FY21, and some changes to our employee assisted housing program. We're very pleased that we can provide $20 million of affordable housing funding for those folks who are looking to buy a first-time home, but it's not as much as we would have liked to provide otherwise.
Okay, I want to pursue this a little further, Director. So first, I am surprised by the reduction in the preservation fund. I mean, dollar for dollar, preservation is the most cost-effective way we have to preserve our affordable housing. And just to make a fine point on it here, it looks in the budget like we are slashing the preservation funding in this budget by 94%, from 12 million down to just 800,000. I mean, how can we, first, certainly COVID has become the #1 issue for all of us, but right past that is affordable housing. It always polls as the #1 issue. And I always say, I can't go to a dinner party when I get invited to one and allowed to go to one without having people talk about the cost of housing in this city. So what are we doing here? And certainly this has been a hallmark of the Bowser administration, I think, really being very good on affordable housing. So this seems like a really drastic turn for the mayor and the administration on housing.
Well, Councilmember Silverman, what I would say is, as you are right, housing is a signature issue, and beyond education and public safety, the issue for Mayor Bowser. And so it shouldn't be lost on any of us how difficult it was to produce a budget where we couldn't invest in preservation in the manner in which we wanted to. But as the mayor has been saying, as we've talked about this budget for the last couple of days, It required some really difficult choices, and everybody had to give. And while we would absolutely prefer to keep preservation where it was, it just really came down to some of those difficult trade-offs. We're still very pleased that we have $100 million in for the Housing Production Trust Fund. We have $1 million in for preservation, which will be leveraged for $4 million. We do have the Housing Purchase Assistance Program, the Employee Assistance Purchase Program as well. And we do have new investments in the Housing Authority, all working to preserve affordable housing. And so we look forward to the next couple of years where the forecast improves and we can come back. And it is important to say, even with this investment, we have not moved off the goal of producing 36,000 housing units in the District of Columbia. So we're still very focused on that as an opportunity.
So, Mr. City Administrator, it is such a drastic turn, and I think it deserves a little bit more time and attention here. I mean, I, as well as Councilmember Bonds, was part of the mayor's housing strike force, and one of the recommendations was to create this preservation team because we know, again, that the best way to spend our housing dollars is to preserve the affordable housing we have. I see the chairman's leaning in, which means my time is up. So I'll just say that I think this should be a big concern for my colleagues. I don't think this is a good a turn of events when it comes to the preservation money. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Councilmember Silverman. Councilmember Robert White, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I do want to mention, because other people asked about it, I did not, but the cut system of our housing programs and homelessness programs for individuals, I'm very concerned about. Those are things I intend to work through as the budget continues. But I wanted to ask a question for Mr. DeWitt. I do understand you laid out at the beginning, Mr. DeWitt, the reasoning for sort of protecting the budget and spending levels as they are. And I do follow that reasoning, the concern that there may be a second wave and we have to be prepared for that wave. But I want to unpack it a little bit so that I understand the decisions better. You have mentioned in various press conferences, and the mayor has cited it as well, and estimated, I think it was 20% of local businesses that may not reopen at the end of this. Is that like roughly our calculation?
Councilmember, when we look at and this is in discussions with the Restaurant Association and the analysis of what's going on, it's expected that possibly 20% of the restaurants in particular will have a very difficult time of reopening. At least it will take a year or more to reopen. And when you look at the forecast and you look at the impacts that this is having on small businesses and things like that, and there is a lot of a national analysis on this as well, we're probably going to go back for a while to what I would call a 90% economy. 10% of it will have a hard time coming back even after we get into the recovery because of the impact it's going to have on some businesses and their ability to come back. The success of the PPP program and other federal programs will have a large determination on that, candidly. But we do expect there to be, in some sectors, 20% or more will struggle to come back. And that will have an impact on, obviously, revenues recovering all the way in 2022.
Roughly, what is the economic impact of those businesses not coming back from lost taxes, be they business taxes, income taxes, stresses on unemployment insurance? Roughly, what's the financial hit from that?
Probably when you look in the long term and you take the forecast out, I would say, and this is just a rough estimate, kind of on the fly here, but I think it'd be fairly close. You could be talking a couple $100 million that you will be in taxes that you'll have a hard time recovering easily in the long run. That will take some time. If you remember the forecast, we don't get back to 2019 levels until 2022. So It's a 2-year hit. And then we would be even higher though in 2022 if not for that pandemic. So it's kind of popped our base down a little bit. So $200 to $300 million range, I think, is a permanent loss of that, or at least not the permanent loss, the loss that will take a little longer to recover when you're losing. The hospitality industry is $500 million of our sales taxes alone. So then you take that and you take that into the income tax side. There's going to be some hotels going to struggle to reopen too, because so many of them are dark, particularly the smaller ones with that aren't national chains.
So if we take into account the kind of almost guaranteed closures of businesses and losses of jobs versus the possible second wave, why do we not, I guess, more aggressively spend down the rainy day funds in order to stem that tide? Because it looks like, even just based on this rough calculation, we may face a greater financial loss from those businesses closing than the loss of the amount of revenues we would spend from the rainy day fund.
Well, keep in mind, some of them just are, that's the lost tax revenue, not what it would cost to keep them from going down. I mean, I think the point of preserving businesses, the federal government has to play a major role in that. We're not big enough. So to actually keep those businesses from going under, you're talking about covering their payroll, their expenses and everything else, which is far below. We don't have enough reserves in total. We could use all of them, and it wouldn't be enough. That's why there's billions of dollars put into PPP programs to try to do that.
Well, that's true, except that if they hit that kind of 90% or anywhere near the 90% reopen, then they start to kind of get some fuel to continue, right?
Yeah, I mean, the issue is we need to have enough liquidity to handle, the coming months. And we're talking about, what do you do for them to keep them, to get them going in the long run and stay sustainable? If we use our liquidity that we have left and it gets worse, then we can't help ourselves to help them. So it's that issue of how much do you need to help yourself to help them. And I think where we're at with the cash flow reserve and the emergency and contingency, we could well tap through all those. And if they're not there, you'd be talking almost certain significant cutting of programs and layoffs. So those are the tough choices, obviously, we all have to make. My advice to you is what you have left is what you need to handle our ability to function without significantly cutting the programs everybody's been discussing. And what we need to do is, in that $750 we should be getting is take a look at how to deploy that to do the things that you're talking about. That's the money that you want to have those considerations about, is how do you deploy that money to keep businesses going and reopen successfully? The money we have left in our reserves, we may need that to not have massive further reductions to all the programs that you've all been talking about. And candidly, if you go down too deep in it, we will get a downgrade. And I know that's not just something that, it's a mantle or a medal you have on there. That has real impacts on how much your capital program costs and how much your ability to get through a downturn if things get worse, where we need the banks to help us out. So that's the reason for my advice in that area.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That was my last question for today.
Thank you, Councilmember. Councilmember Gray, for 5 minutes. Councilmember Gray, you're muted.
Can't hear you.
You're unmuted.
Okay, thank you. You can hear me now?
Yes.
Thank you very much. It was interesting today to hear about BARD moving to what has been the Malcolm X building in Ward 8. Because we've had lots of discussion about that issue, not that specific issue, but something related to it in last couple of months in particular, with the residents of Eastland Gardens, because the work that's being done at Smothers, the modernization of Smothers School, has led to then the decision to relocate the students of Smothers School over to Kenilworth, which of course is virtually in the heart of Eastland Gardens. And there's not been a lot of happiness about that from the residents of Eastland Gardens. For those who know Eastland Gardens, it is a wonderful community populated by people who have worked very hard to be able to own their homes there. They worked very hard to raise the community up to where it is at this stage. I guess the question I have is the following: that if Bard is going to move from Davis Davis School, which is where they are now, will that then, as a result, free up the Davis School to be available for a swing school, which would then be very important to what appears to be 3 or 4 schools, at least 2 or 3 schools that are designated to be modernized, so that when those students have to move from wherever they are, Neville Thomas or other schools that are going to be modernized, can we then count on Davis once again becoming a swing school since Bard is moving, and that the people in the residents in Eastland Gardens will not be burdened in the way that they're going to be now for potentially 6 years, which is part of the discussion that's gone on. So, Mr. City Administrator, can you enlighten us as to what will happen once Bard moves out of there, which is in a couple of years, I suppose? Does then Davis become free and available once again to be used as a swing school as it had been for the last several years?
The short answer to that, Councilmember, is yes. Once Bard is at its new home, then Davis then comes back to us as a swing location. But I would say that Kenilworth is still an important part of the swing space strategy overall. But yes, Davis, we can put Davis back online, which hopefully should relieve some of the pressure that the folks in Eastland Gardens are feeling because Kenilworth was the swing school for that side of the city. And certainly DCPS would continue to engage with the Eastland Gardens community about how to be a good neighbor when and if Kenilworth is continued to be used as a swing school, and make sure that we can still accommodate the activities that Eastland Garden expects to have happened as they have historically.
Well, my effort right now would be to focus on bringing Davis back as a swing school, and then relieve the people who live in Eastland Gardens from what they clearly don't like. I mean, they're not, they don't mince any words when one talks to them. And there are large numbers of them who we've met with, including with the chancellor and the DGS leadership as well, about what happens, because they were told at one point that this could go on for 6 years, which is a hugely lengthy period.
Yeah, and Councilmember, I think it's worth a discussion with you about what the swing strategy looks like and what schools are in the queue and what our options are as we bring Davis back online to become a swing school.
All right, I'll be happy to do that, and I'll be happy to have you, meet with me if you would.
Sure.
The residents leadership of Eastland Gardens. Again, it's a great community, and I would hope that we can return the community back to the people who live there at this point. So I'll look forward to that discussion, and I'll pass along this conversation for those who are not watching now. I'll pass along this conversation to the folks in Eastland Gardens as well.
Thank you, Councilmember. There'll be one more round. Councilmember Trayon White.
Yes, thank you. I wanted to ask City Administrator Young about the automobile ticket amnesty that's projected to bring some positive revenues in the district and also help a lot of residents with some relief around tickets. Are we still moving forward with that?
In 21.
We're still moving forward with that in fiscal year 21. We have been working with the CFO's office as well to make sure that they were in fact prepared and their systems, cash receipts for systems, were in fact prepared to accept the amnesty. It did require some reprogramming and some IT modifications to be able to move that forward. But yes, we're going to move forward with that.
Thank you. I also want to know, we don't know, well, I haven't heard how long this is going to prolong. Was there any thoughts on extending our education system throughout the summer for like a summer school to cut in or relieve or address the issue of not being in school to make sure our kids are not falling behind?
Yes, Councilmember, on Friday, the mayor will talk about what the summer strategy looks like, and that includes both for plans for DCPS for additional learning, as well as our summer activities like summer camps and SYEP. So we will be providing an update about that issue on Friday.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
On a separate topic, we've been having a number of concerns around trash pickup on street cleaning as it relates to trash pickup, not the actual trash can, but trash cleaning down the streets with DPW in conjunction with DDOT. A number of residents have expressed concerns about the lack of street cleaning that takes place in Ward 8. And we would like to get some answers around what's the plan to retrofit our streets to get the signs, get the streets clean. And I know that
are you asking about litter pickup or the actual street cleaning with the street cleaning machine? Street sweeping. You're talking about street sweeping?
Street sweeping machines.
Okay.
Our streets are extremely filthy, dirty, and the part of the process is that residents have to fill out a form and go through. But there are a number of residents who are engaged, but there are some who are not as engaged, but they still have the right for their streets to be clean, and we need some executive push to get that happening on our streets. Our streets are extremely filthy.
Happy to work with your office on that specifically in particular neighborhoods where you're seeing that as an issue. For neighborhoods that have street sweeping already designated, one of the challenges during the pandemic is that many people are at home. We've relaxed parking standards on neighborhoods and streets, which makes it difficult, if not impossible, for us to do street sweeping as we typically would, because we also don't want to ticket and move cars. But in instances where street sweeping isn't occurring and you want to talk about where it should be occurring, happy to work with you on that.
Thank you. I did want to overemphasize the need for more investment in public safety. I want to thank you and the mayor for the answer received earlier, but I do want to ask what are the increases to ensure that we are addressing the issue of public safety, especially throughout the summer months where we know that the crime increases around the district. And we've seen a number of shootings in the last couple of days.
Yeah, council member. So the summer crime initiatives have already started with MPD across the community, as we have typically done. So we will be focused on those and are focused on those now. We still have ones, the Office of Neighborhood Safety Engagement engaged. Our credible messengers are also engaged. We've done directed overtime and patrols through MPD in neighborhoods that have experienced hotspots and then experienced certainly unacceptable violent crime in those communities. So all of those tools and resources we continue to deploy this spring and this summer to try to really abate any violent crime that's occurring in the neighborhoods.
Thank you. Chairman.
Councilmember White, that concludes your questions this round?
Yes.
All right, last round. I had a couple more questions for Mr. DeWitt. Could Mr. DeWitt, when we've looked at providing some relief in the past, like when we allowed hotels to defer their real property taxes, and then we talked about doing more of that, you said there was a liquidity issue. Now we've authorized you borrowing short-term in August. Actually, I think we just authorized it this fiscal year, and it's your choice as to when. How comfortable are you with our liquidity situation?
I would say we're comfortable that we have put in place things in the event of an emergency that we won't be illiquid. In other words, we got the $500 million of emergency legislation, which we appreciate very much the council approving, that we can use. We don't want to use those though. If we use the tax revenue anticipation notes, those have to be paid back in September. That would be okay. So that's the one we would use first. If we use the 300 million GO notes to cover our liquidity because it gets even more drastic, that has to be actually budgeted and repaid in 2021. And that is not in the budget. So that is there as an emergency. But if we use it, it means we're in a situation where there's now a budget impact from it. So we believe we have things are on track as we expected, but they're no better than we expected. And the one concern Councilmember McDuffie raised a bit ago, if there's a delay in income tax filings to, let's say, December, then we would be probably okay with the trans capability. But I guess the short answer is we believe we're okay. Everything is on track. Things are coming in as expected. We have the tools to deal with it. We do not want to use the tools because one of them actually has a budget impact. But our liquidity is okay. If you're asking about additional deferments, I think we would have to look to see where we are probably in early June to see what that impact would be, if that's where you would be leading with your question.
Currently, the country's in a recession. Is that correct?
That would be my opinion. Yes, strong opinion.
And typically in a recession, credit tightens. Typically, is that correct?
That would be normally yes.
And in late March, was there not a credit crisis?
There was, and that's been freed up quite a bit by some actions by the Federal Reserve and Treasury to free up some of the markets to make them function again. They actually weren't functioning for a while in March. So those are better, but they're better for really high quality credits. And that's again why it's important that we maintain a high quality credit.
Which gets you back to your point about our being careful. But where I'm going is, again, trying to understand whether for the first time in your life, you're not being conservative enough. So we could go to
You're making the
market.
CH laugh here.
We could, and you expect we will go to the market for some level of trans borrowing in August?
We're not sure yet. It's there in case we need it, but it's real close. That would be repaid in September, but at the current moment, I think we can get through without it. But if they defer the income tax payments, for example, then that probably would trigger us probably need to use a trans.
Yes. And if there were to be a credit crisis again, because we are in a recession and we don't know if the curve comes back, the virus comes back. If there was a credit crisis in August, then maybe you can't go to the market for trans?
We've already got it set up. So it's already established to take, we are already prepared. We've already got it approved. We've already got it ready to go. We would trigger it before then if we got to that point. So we're covered in that category to deal with that because of the actions we've taken to get us in a place where we already have it approved. We already have it available. We can go get it anytime we need it. We've already done all the work to do that. There's states and cities that have not, that may have a challenge if what you describe happens. We have already got it all locked in if we need to do it.
Okay, that sounds pretty confident.
In that area, yes.
So let me shift. I suspect that we're going to hear over the next several weeks while the budget we're going through our hearings, that we should be doing more with regard to our reserves. Now, I've heard you talk yesterday at the press conference and today in your remarks about the reserves, and we need to be prudent. And I may be out of time. So why can't we ratchet down the reserves another day or two?
So where we are, we believe that we can take, so we're going to have to go in July to the market and refinance $1 billion in income tax debt and GO debt to save the $80 million that you get the opportunity to have that revenue benefit from in the budget. If the reserves are at the level where we believe that if you went very much further, in other words, further than maybe we may be a bit short of cash, then we would not hold our AAA rating. That 80 million depends on us holding that AAA rating. If we don't have it, then we can't go get that. Now you're 80 million short. The other thing is the CIP, the interest rates in the capital improvement program for the 7.9 million, assume we hold that AAA rating. If we drop just to a AA we were a few years ago, the CIP would have to be cut by at least 15 to 20%. So your CIP would have to be reduced. So if you use the reserves, you're going to have an impact on your capital program, and you're going to have the impact on our ability to go to the market to refinance. Our AAA credit allows us to save $80 million in a restructuring that you do during a recession that we're going to be doing in July and August. If suddenly we take actions through whatever's done that jeopardizes that rating and I can't go to the rating agencies and hold that, I can't do the 80 million. The CIP is now too big because the debt will cost more. If the cash flow were to be tapped and I don't have enough to operate the government, I'll have to borrow, use that GO note and borrow it, and you'll have to budget to pay that back. So using more reserves will cost you more than you'll get out of it, because your capital program will be negatively impacted. You have to borrow short term and pay it back, and you can't refinance to the way that we're assuming. We're assuming a AAA credit in this budget. If it's not, then the budget's not valid anymore.
Thank you, and I'm over my time. Councilmember Che, last round, 5 minutes.
Thank you. I will probably follow up with the questions I have through the regular hearing process, except that I had one additional question that occurred to me while we were proceeding here. Is the freeze on hiring and raises that we can control, does all of this include losses of positions through attrition that won't be filled?
So a couple of things. The freeze on hiring that occurred in fiscal year 20, which generated significant savings for us to close the hole, is as it relates to fiscal 20 only. For fiscal year 21, we have either eliminated vacancies, we cut vacant positions, but in most cases, increased the vacancy savings rate for agencies to be able to capture that savings. So there will be vacancies on the books, but those agencies won't be able to fill those vacancies as they have to capture that savings.
So as the agency goes on and 3 people leave for other jobs or something like that, those positions will remain unfilled?
That's correct. Where we have increased the vacancy savings rate, that's correct.
Okay. All right, thank you. That's all. I'm sorry.
Jeffrey?
No, I'm sorry. I didn't want to interrupt. Okay. That's all I have, Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Che. Councilmember Bonds, do you have any questions? Last round, 5 minutes.
Yes, thank you very much, Chairman. I note that in the FY21 budget that there is a property tax abatement that would be available to the larger affordable housing producers, the developers, if they do 350 units. And 1/3 of the units are supposedly at 80% AMI. And I'm just a little curious about this because it says that the selected neighborhoods are considered high need. That is Rock Creek East, Rock Creek West, Capitol Hill, and Upper Northeast. But I'm concerned because the abatement has a lifetime of 40 years. And I'm not sure any of us would think that these communities would be high need as we continue. 40 years is a long time. And so I'm just wondering, isn't this timeline for the abatement a little excessive?
So, Councilmember Bonds, let me try to clarify a couple of things. One, the housing equity report that was done that produced the recommendations and the target for the 36,000 units identified high need areas, meaning that those were areas where there was not a substantial or significant or hardly any affordable housing. So that's what we mean by high need areas. Those areas don't have affordable housing. The abatement is that around 33% of those units have to be at 80% income or below. And the abatement also was tied to a 40-year covenant. So what we're doing is requiring those areas that they receive the abatement to ensure for a 40-year period, they maintain that period of affordability.
And I understand that. What I'm questioning is the timeline. 40 years is a long time in my estimation, 40 years because, and the reason for the abatement is because these are high need communities. And 40 years, Rock Creek West or Capitol Hill or Upper Northeast might very easily be have other affordable units located within. And so I'm just wondering why for 40 years. That's my real question.
Sure. And the reason that the abatement period is for so long is that these are really high income areas, and we don't think without an incentive here like this abatement that the market will produce affordability. If we look at even this 40-year period, given where the economics are today and the values are today, it is highly unlikely that by themselves, these neighborhoods would produce any substantial affordable housing. And so the reason the abatement period is that long is because we want to make sure that these areas that haven't seen affordable housing and probably would never see affordable housing actually produce it.
Yes, and I agree with you on that concept. I'm just wondering if a situation would lend itself to maybe first trump a timeline would be 15 years with the option to renew for another 15 years and to renew for another 15 years. That way we have an opportunity to change the equation if we need to.
No, I hear you. I just think as we look at development financing and look at the period of time that is required for or that is planned for when we're trying to incent this kind of development, we think this is the right way to go.
All right. Thank you.
Ma'am.
Thank
you,
you,
ma'am.
Thank you, Chair.
Councilmember Bonds, that concludes your questions. Councilmember.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. City.
Go on.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. City Administrator, I want to come back again to affordable housing. You had mentioned, or Budget Director Reed had mentioned HPAP and EHAP, the Employee Assistance Program. It looks like those are also taking severe cuts in your budget. From my reading, it looks like there's more than 11 million in cuts to both HPAP and the Employee Assistance Program. I don't even know how to pronounce that acronym. And, you know, certainly coupled with your proposal to eliminate COLA increases, this puts our employees and our low-income home buyers in a really difficult position. I guess help me understand why we are cutting these programs. It looks like about 80% in this budget.
So what we've done is really we've right-sized these programs based upon their historical spending. So for example, the historical spend in this program is at $20 million. We're funding it at $18 million. And so as we went across just virtually every program and every agency, as we look to close the gap, we looked at how we can ensure that we're matching what the demand is as best we can to what the budget is for. And so in sizing the HPAP program for 21, we based that upon what the historical spending is in 20 and in 19. And so that delta, the difference between what is expected to be spent in 20, for example, is $20 million, and then what we have budgeted in 21 is $18 million.
I mean, I give you credit, Mr. City Administrator, for coming up with, you know, a good answer, But I mean, the reality is
Councilmember, it's better than I take exception to coming up with a good answer. What we're trying to do is tell you how we close the $750 million gap. And so I take offense to what sounds like, and I'm sure that's not your intention, a flippant answer to your question, because that is not the case.
No, no, and I didn't mean to offend you, and I apologize, but as we talked about in the last round, affordable housing is the number, until COVID came along, affordable housing is the #1 issue. And I can't think, I can count, I don't have enough fingers and toes to count on how many times we have said on this dais how important it is to put as much money in affordable housing as possible. And what I meant by my answer is that, certainly one way of thinking about housing spending would be to say, well, we've done a lot of increases, so we're going to have to dial that back. But the reality for our residents, as you know, because housing has been the #1 priority for the Bowser administration, as it should be, given that it is a crisis. And it's going to be even more of a crisis as people have their incomes reduced. So again, as I said, I didn't mean to offend you, but I'm just saying, I understand that is one way of doing some analysis to determine where to make those cuts, but we are an unaffordable city, not just for poor people, but for middle-class residents as well. And I think what we're seeing in COVID is, the loss of income is not just the people using our unemployment insurance system aren't just the low income residents. We have middle-class residents who are really struggling, and housing is going to be even more important to them. So I apologize if I offended you. That was not my intention. But I do want to ask about one other area, and I just have to warn you, Mr. Chairman, I do have some unstable internet, so I can't see the clock. You'll have to tell me when I'm done. But I do want to ask about, there's also 23 million less, or we're losing $23 million from lower projected grant awards in the housing sphere, according to the budget. Can you tell us, Mr. City Administrator, what awards are those, and why won't we be getting those funds?
Councilmember, I'm not sure what you're looking at when you make that reference, and so if you could help me out with that, I would be happy to try to answer that. The other piece with respect to housing, I just want to throw in very quickly, besides the discussion we just had with Councilmember Bonds, we also are having other tools to focus on affordable housing. For example, DMPED's coordinating a new body with housing agency partners to focus on affordable housing. One result of that is the library board passing a resolution to look at all new library projects to include affordable housing. And then let's also remember we have the strategic import of the comp plan as we look at maximizing density and height as a way to create more opportunity for affordable housing. But to your last question, I'm not sure what the 23 million is that you're referring to. If you could just help me.
And I want to note that the member is over her time. A very quick follow-up, council member.
How about we'll do this, Mr. Chairman. I will send to you, Mr. City Administrator, what I'm referring to, and maybe you can give me an answer in writing.
Great, fantastic, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Silverman. Councilmember Gray, 5 minutes, last round.
Am I unmuted?
We can hear you.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. City Administrator, one of the efforts right now in Ward 7 that has really captured a lot of attention and the engagement of a lot of people is the desire to have Pennsylvania Avenue designated as a main street. It was actually in the letter that I sent forward of the budget priorities that I wanted to establish. And that was, of course, before we got into this COVID-19 dilemma that we're in now. So, but that isn't going to change the fact that people want to see this happen. There's a lot of energy that's been put into it, a lot of efforts that's been put into it. And so what's the likelihood? What can be done to be able to move forward something that has captured the attention and the imagination of so many people who live in Ward 7, many of whom live on or right just beyond Pennsylvania Avenue Southeast, the Penn Branch area, for example, or parts of Hillcrest, or parts of other areas of Ward 7. So can you help me understand what is that we need to do to be able to get this, to get the kind of attention that it deserves? Again, I understand what happened when we went into this COVID-19 dilemma that we're in now, but that's not going to last forever. And Pennsylvania Avenue will still be sitting there waiting to be addressed by our city. And I'd like to be able to tell people that, there is an understanding and an acceptance of the need, and that we'll look forward to working on it.
Well, I do think, Councilmember, there is certainly an understanding of the need there. We worked really hard to make sure that we could maintain the 25 main streets that are in the budget now at their current levels, and then also maintain the 36 great streets that we have. And we were able to do that in 21 to maintain those main streets and those great streets as they exist already. And so when our revenue circumstances improve, certainly we would want to come back and revisit the opportunity to add more main streets, and then take a look at particularly Pennsylvania Southeast.
Well, it really should be a priority, Mr. City Administrator. As you know, it's something that we've talked about, something that I think deserves attention of you and your administration, and the mayor and her administration. So I would ask that be done sooner than later, that it be established as a priority as we move forward. And I'll look forward to working with you and the mayor to be able to bring the kind of attention to Pennsylvania Avenue Southeast that it deserves at this stage. The only other issue I want to talk about right now is, as you know, much of Ward 7 and certainly parts of Ward 8 as well are food deserts, where we have such a dearth of full service grocery stores. You look at the numbers, we have some wards, for example, that have as many as 9 or 10 full service grocery stores. Ward 7 has 2 Safeways, and Ward 8, I think, has 1. That's a giant. And we have legislation that's been, was adopted, enacted by the council, that was signed by the mayor, that was establishing us to be able to make the investments in developing, investing in full service grocery stores. One of the things that we had hoped, of course, is that through the reserves that have been built up, that we would be able to have dollars available to be able to build grocery stores, especially in Ward 7, through that legislation. We realize what the demands have been with respect to COVID-19. So, but on the assumption, which I think is a safe assumption, we'll get out of this, and we'll get out of this sooner than later. What can be done to be able to make sure that that legislation is effectuated in the ways that were envisioned in the first place to address the challenges that we are saddled with? When you talk about healthcare, which you all have we have talked about it a lot. We know that we are making strides there now. But when you talk about healthcare, you got to be able to include what people eat every day as well. You want people to be healthy? We do, of course. And I would imagine you do too as well. How are we going to address that dual issue without addressing the grocery store issue?
Yeah, so first I'd say in the near term, the today term, if you will, we certainly do have the Neighborhood Prosperity Fund, which we have been able to leverage to help improve and make investments there to address that issue. Once we get on the up curve of the Nike swoosh, as the CFO indicates, and we can start to fill our reserves, and if we are back to the point of surpluses where there's a portion of funds that go to PAYGO, then I think we have opportunities to talk about then how we might effectuate other investments as we make allocations from that PAYGO account.
Well, there's no question that we understand, the kind of dilemma that we're faced with at this point. But the legislation that was put together anticipated being able to have that PAYGO money available to invest in grocery stores that people desperately need. In Ward 7, not only just Ward 7, but Ward 7 on the east end of the city. Ward 7 and Ward 8 deserve better than what they've gotten at this point. And the food options are just not available. We really are in a food desert, to say the least. So I would hope to move forward with that much sooner than later.
The member's time has expired. Council Member Trayon White.
Thank you, Chairman. City Administrator, can you tell me more about the rent and utility assistance in this budget? For example, who will be eligible and what the parameters will be around this?
Council member, I'm happy to help answer your question. So in the current budget proposal before you, we continue to have support for our emergency rental assistance program in the Department of Human Services and our LIHEAP program through the Department of Energy and the Environment. We are also fortunate that there are additional LIHEAP funds coming from the federal government, I think close to $3 million. To help with what we know will be rising demand for people to help pay their utility bills. And then currently we're looking at 3 different buckets of funds for additional rental assistance coming through the federal government. So the first is rental assistance that we can provide more for our ERAP program through our Emergency Solutions Grant. We are currently waiting on HUD to tell us exactly how much we're going to get, but we believe it'll be $5 million. There's close to $11 million in community development block grant funds coming to the Department of Housing and Community Development. And some of that will be used for rental assistance for people that don't qualify for ERAP. Some of it will also go to our nonprofit providers to help provide more housing counseling assistance, because we know that a lot of people will need some help. And then there's also money coming to the Housing Authority and to private owners of HUD insured properties, so like project-based Section 8 properties, to help those landlords make sure that if some tenants lose their jobs and lose their income, they're not going to lose their housing assistance as well. So it provides some additional income to those landlords. We are still getting all the details from the federal government on those programs. We expect to be able to announce those in the coming weeks and months as those details become available.
So thank you. I guess for clarity, will this be open to new people coming into the system needing housing assistance, or already existing families who are already getting assistance or living in subsidized or public housing?
So for the emergency rental assistance program and the attendant assistance program that DHCD will set up, those will be for people who may not be getting rental assistance currently. The funding going to the Housing Authority and to private landlords that have HUD insured properties are for people that are currently living in that subsidized housing.
Thank you. One of my other questions, as you know, we're in a housing crisis prior to COVID-19, and we're anticipating even more after the city recovers, is that we have a number of people that are feeling housing insecurities, City Administrator, and we talked about the community land trusts that I proposed to come to the district, one specifically in Ward 8, to allow people to buy houses and increase their wealth, and while we support a program like this. Has there been any additional thoughts on funding something like this east of the Anacostia River to ensure that we can not only just get apartments and housing for people, but people buying power, which is critically as important in decreasing the wealth gap in the district?
Yeah, Councilmember, I did appreciate our discussion about the community land trust idea that you forwarded in your letter and your description of what that could do. I think that's something that should be on the table for our future discussion. With respect to this budget and financial plan period, that is not something we were able to get in and dedicate new resources to, but certainly want to keep exploring that opportunity with you.
All right, and we will. I guess my next question is around Berry Farm. We've moved a number of residents out of Berry Farm, all residents out of Berry Farm, which was originally 400 plus units. I know we are slated to bring 300 plus units online. Where are we in the redevelopment phase of Berry Farms, and is that is that funded in the budget? I know phase 1 was originally funded in the budget. Where are we with the entire project?
Yep, Council Member. So there is $36 million allocated in the capital budget for investment in all of various new communities projects. In the Berry Farm case, there's still the matter of zoning that still has to be processed and moved through. And so I know that DMPED is excited and prepared to talk about the specifics around each of the new community projects. And certainly Berry Farm is still a priority. It's on the table, but we've got to really resolve the zoning question before that really moves forward in earnest.
Thank you. I would like to stay abreast of that, and also the recent move around the construction of those living in the Vistas and Forest Ridge, also known as Wellington Park and Stanton Oaks. We could talk about it offline.
All right, thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember White. That's going to then conclude the rounds of questions for this hearing. Before I adjourn the hearing, I do want to go over, I have notes that there were two things for the executive to follow up. Councilmember Trayon White had asked for the budgets for the Ward 7 and 8 schools. If you would provide that to him as well as to me as chair of the committee of the whole. I asked, though, that you not only give us what the budgets are for those schools for FY21, but for the current year so that we can make a comparison using the same assumptions. As you know, there are different ways of casting the school budgets. So we'd like to be able to compare current year with next year and see the comparison for the word.
Mr. Chairman, this is Councilmember Grosso. Can I also please get copied on the response?
We'll provide that to all of the members.
Thank you.
Yes. Well, anything that's provided to the committee of the whole will be shared with all the members. The other question is, our follow-up is, I had asked near the beginning about where the dollars, I'm looking at my question here. The dollar, it's something like $158 million that's for the reopened DC. I think this would maybe come from Ms. Reed, if you could provide us with some detail to that. Understand where we can find it, look for it, see it. And
Yes, I can do that.
I don't believe there were any other requests for information or documents, but of course there will be at the hearings. I believe the first committee hearing is this Thursday, and the hearings will continue through the committee of the whole hearing, which I think is June 18th. There will be lots of opportunity for our asking more questions and getting information. The council's schedule of hearings is posted on the council's website, so it should be available to anybody who wants to see what committees are having hearings when. And those hearings are all scheduled in 3-hour time blocks. Some committees have combined their time blocks for a longer hearing. That's going to conclude this hearing then. I want to thank the mayor and her people, which includes, I'm only looking at who's still on the call, excuse me, on the hearing, City Administrator Rashad Young and the Budget Director Jenny Reed. Thank you, each of you. Thank you, Chief Financial Officer Jeffrey DeWitt. Remember, you're ours for the next 56 days. And with that, the time is 4:43 and this hearing is adjourned.
Thank you.